Chapter 2070. At the highest point of this flat world, the pull between the dozen or so cultivators and the flat world was still continuing. Even though this part of the world seemed to have fallen into the end of the world due to the pull, with all living beings dying and the world withering away, the dozen or so cultivators here only had eyes for the concept of peace that was gradually being refined by them. Any kind of concept, when used to its limit, would possess the power to destroy the heavens and the earth. Even a seemingly mundane concept like flatness would be able to wipe out countless worlds if it was used well. At this moment, the dozen or so cultivators who were struggling with the concept of equality were the clearest about this. This was because at this moment, all of their bodies were undergoing an indescribable change. The original bumps and bumps on their bodies were gradually smoothed out, and the original ups and downs on their skin were rapidly being eliminated. Even the power within their bodies and their life essence were undergoing all sorts of mysterious yet subtle changes at this moment. Now, the old man roared at this moment. Along with this roar, the other cultivators exerted their strength at the same time. The chains condensed from the concepts they grasped abruptly tightened at this moment, and the pulling force it released increased by more than 10 times in the blink of an eye. Under this sudden increase in power, the world abruptly stopped for a breath's time. In this breath's time, all the energy flow in the world stopped. Even the operation of laws, the flow of time, and the undulations of space all stopped in this breath's time. Even the flow of time stopped. This breath's time could perhaps be considered as an infinitely long period of time. After all, there was no time. This breath's time was naturally equivalent to an infinite amount of time. However, this was only for ordinary beings who did not grasp extraordinary power. For powerful cultivators like Na Jianbin who grasped supreme power, they could naturally see through the surface and grasp this most fundamental change. They knew that this time stopping only lasted for a breath's time. After a breath of time, the expressions of the dozen or so cultivators became incomparably excited. In front of them, the chains formed from their concepts had already wrapped around an extremely huge ball that seemed to fill up the world, yet it also seemed extremely small. It seemed that even the smallest scale could not describe the size of the strange air mass. This strange mass of air was very strange. Although it had an irregular shape, it was like smoke constantly rolling around in the chain, but it gave off a kind of flat aura. It was as if this form of smoke was the flattest thing in the universe. It could even be said to be the representation of flatness, the definition of flatness. It really is the most original power. The dozen or so cultivators looked extremely excited at this moment. Directly facing such a pure concept, they were unable to maintain their absolute independence. Under the influence of that concept, they were unable to maintain their absolute independence. Each of them had more or less changed. Every cultivator's form seemed to have turned into an abstract form, and all sorts of shapes and turns became incomparably sharp. The insides of shapes had become extremely smooth and flat. Under such circumstances, they no longer looked like normal living beings. Instead, they looked more like abstract images. As long as we fuse with this power, we'll be able to obtain the perfect power incarnation and stay on the second level. Fellow Taoist Lan murmured. So this was their goal, in order to obtain the perfect power incarnation. In other words, they would be able to stay on the second level of the Tao Master Path while obtaining the perfect power incarnation. Once the number of living beings increased, naturally, there were all sorts of ideas. For most cultivators who had stepped onto the Tao Master Path, climbing up, ascending to a higher level, and finally breaking through the Tao Master Path to become a legendary Tao Master was their goal. For this goal, those cultivators could give up everything, sacrifice everything, and even do anything. However, among them, there was a small portion that did not have such an objective. Perhaps they had such an objective in the beginning, but under the influence of the great power of time, their thoughts had gradually changed. In the end, they had completely changed at some point in time. Obviously, the dozen or so cultivators in front of them were such cultivators. For them, ascending to the third level was no longer their goal. They were more willing to obtain the supreme power and become a supreme existence comparable to the Tao Master's disciples in the second level of the Tao Master path. To become a powerful existence that could at least become an overlord. In their hearts, they even had the ambition to pull down the Tao Master's disciples and stand at the highest position. Of course, they naturally could not say this ambition in the depths of their hearts, and they did not even dare to show a trace of it. After all, it was against the incredible experts of the Tao Master's disciples, who knew if they had any means to nip it in the bud. Let's begin. This power should be enough for all of us. At this moment, the old man's eyes revealed a fanatical aura. In order to form the perfect incarnation of the concept, the most important thing was not the quantity of the concept, but the quality of the concept. In other words, for the cultivators on the second level of the Tao Master path, no matter what method they used, as long as they could master the concept to a certain level, they would naturally be able to form the perfect incarnation of the concept. If they knew how to condense the concept incarnation, the perfect incarnation would naturally appear. That was to say, for these cultivators, they wanted to obtain the flat concept at this time, but in fact they just wanted to use this concept as a primer to change their own concept. As for the concept itself, they did not want to snatch it, nor did they want to take it for themselves. This was inevitable. If they wanted to take these ideas for themselves, unless they were absolutely sure that these ideas were enough for all of them to share, how could these dozen or so cultivators gather together and act together like this? Were they not afraid that others would secretly attack them in order to monopolize the benefits? Only this kind of concept did not need to be touched by them. They only needed to use it as a primer to purify their own concept, or in their eyes, the mixed mysterious power that they had mastered, so that their interests could be synchronized. Only then could fellow Taoist Nalan, who is very likely to become the overlord of this world, offer this world to them. We need to hurry up. With our abilities, we must hurry up. With our ability, we can only restrict these powers for 100 years at most. The boy said with a serious expression at this time. Hearing his words, the others' expressions became solemn, and they did not dare to be negligent. All of them began to use their own methods to sense and comprehend the smoke-like concept that was sealed by their chains. After this concept of peace was extracted, the entire world fell into a state of doomsday. It was as if the entire world had lost its supporting skeleton. All the energy and matter in the world had been sucked dry. All the rules and laws, and even the space-time itself, began to collapse and be continuously destroyed, turning into indescribable chaos that began to fill the regions that originally existed. The chaos continued to accumulate, and at the same time, it exerted even greater pressure on the regions that were still intact, pushing the process of their destruction even further. Such a tragic scene of the end of the world was a terrifying disaster that the living beings in this part of the world could not even dream of. The order of civilization collapsed extremely quickly. In just a few short months, the entire world had been turned into ruins. A large portion of the ruins were caused by the collapse of the world. However, the remaining ones were all man-made. All conflicts between living beings, all caused by the cultivators of this world. In fact, although the first type of ruins were tragic because they had only appeared for a short period of time, they did not cause too much pain to the living beings. On the contrary, the battles and slaughters between living beings brought more pain to the cultivators in this world. This caused the resentment in this world to become even denser. The scale of this flat world was unimaginably large, even though it was collapsing and being destroyed at such a rapid speed. In the end, it took nearly 100 years before it neared the end. Only an area with a circumference of less than 1,000,000 kilometers was left, barely able to maintain its integrity and allow the cultivators to survive in it. Even in this small area that remained intact, the environment had become hundreds of millions of times worse than it was 100 years ago. Killing intent was everywhere, space-time rifts were everywhere, and chaotic energies were everywhere. The natural laws of heaven and earth were even more chaotic, which made any cultivator feel as if they were suddenly blessed by heaven and earth, and then repulsed by heaven and earth at the same time. It was as if their fates were being toyed with by an invisible hand. The place where Jian Ben and the others were located was in this region that was still preserved. The terrifying changes in this world over the past 100 years made them extremely glad that Jian Ben had acted so decisively back then. Among the changes in the world over the past 100 years, they had seen tens of thousands of changes that could have killed them. If Jian Ben had not decisively set up that formation back then to protect them from the chaos of the outside world, they would have probably been struggling between life and death tens of thousands of times. And if they had made a single mistake, they would no longer be alive now. This world is going to be destroyed. Zheng Yi muttered with a hint of panic on his face. The formation used various concepts to construct a simple conceptual space-time that could protect them. Even if the world was destroyed, they would not be affected. However, it was only a formation, not a real conceptual space-time. The changes in the conceptual space-time during the past 100 years had already made them feel that the formation was constantly weakening, and its structure was constantly disintegrating. It could be estimated that even with such pressure, the formation could only last for more than 1,000,000 years at most. In other words, if the changes in this world could be completed in more than 1,000,000 years, they would be safe, and they might even be able to comprehend a trace of inexplicable mysterious power, or in other words, the concept of peace, because they had witnessed the changes of this world over the past 100 years. But if this change lasted for more than 1,000,000 years, then 1,000,000 years might be a long time in the eyes of ordinary living beings. But that was only in the eyes of ordinary living beings. Even a cultivator who had just become an individual immortal would not take 1,000,000 years too seriously. Moreover, they had already reached the second level of the Tao Master's path. Even for cultivators who had already become disciples of a Tao Master, it was impossible for them to take 1,000,000 years seriously. At this time, they were worried about the changes after 1,000,000 years. For them, it was as normal as ordinary people worrying about whether they would have food to eat tomorrow. Very soon, Jian Ben murmured at this time, his eyes shining with incomparable brilliance. The development of the past 100 years had verified the strange idea that he had come up with out of thin air at the beginning time and time again, allowing him to vaguely find a turning point. He even had a feeling that as long as he seized this turning point, he would not only be safe, but also obtain great benefits. Seeing his performance, the other cultivators all showed inexplicable expressions on their faces. In their eyes, Jian Ben's performance was really strange and incomprehensible. In the past 100 years, the horrifying changes in the outside world didn't seem like a disaster. Instead, it seemed like some sort of test. It was as if there was some sort of treasure, some sort of fortuitous encounter waiting for him to grab and seize. Could it be that this is some kind of inheritance of a Tao Master? Several people could not help but have the same thought flashing in their minds. As this thought occurred to them, they all secretly smiled bitterly. Although they had already become disciples of a Tao Master, they were still in a completely different world from the disciples of a Tao Master. For the disciples of a Tao Master, this was common sense. They would probably have to pay everything to be able to obtain even the slightest bit of information. And the divine ability that was regarded as ordinary by the disciples of a Tao Master might be the most mysterious method in the universe. Under such circumstances, if they wanted to guess what kind of divine ability a Tao Master had passed on, that would be completely making things difficult for themselves. Just as everyone was thinking, suddenly, an extremely dazzling light shone from Jian Ben's eyes, and he softly shouted, "This is it! I knew it would be like this!" With this shout, his figure actually directly rushed out of the formation, and before anyone could react, he had already rushed out of the formation brazenly, and directly arrived at the disaster outside the simple concept of the world. The other cultivators looked at each other. Their eyes were full of surprise and uncertainty. Should we follow him? One of the cultivators at this time said with some hesitation. Hearing this, Zheng Yi glanced at him as if he was looking at an idiot. "Are you a disciple of a Tao Master?" That cultivator naturally shook his head. Then, are you a disciple of a Tao master? Zheng Yi continued. After hearing this, the cultivator no longer answered, but there was only a look of realization and lingering fear in his eyes. Obviously, he had completely understood what Zheng Yi meant. He was not a disciple of a Tao master, nor was he a disciple of a Tao master. At most, he was a small rogue cultivator. What was the difference between this and wanting to do something as dangerous as a disciple of a Tao master? What was the difference between that and having a death wish? At this time, Jian Bin did not care about what was happening around him. At this time, in this disaster, at this time, without hesitation, he released his strongest aura. Endless vast aura surged in all directions like the waves of the sea, and in the blink of an eye, it had already swept across the entire world within a radius of 1,000,000 miles. He was an expert of the second tribulation on the second level of the Tao Master's path, and also a disciple of a Tao Master, so there was no need to say that his strength was strong. As this aura swept across, the space-time within a radius of 1,000,000 miles in this instant was completely suppressed, and all changes within it stopped for a moment. At this moment, the entire world seemed to have returned to the state before the end of the world. There was no more disaster, no more pain, and everything was so calm, and everything was so smooth. At this time, a cry of alarm came from somewhere, echoing throughout the entire world. No, I finally succeeded. Why am I still suppressed? Such a loud roar at this time spread throughout the entire world, into the ears of all living beings here at this time. There were a total of 12 such voices, and among them, there was one that Jian Bin was extremely familiar with. It was the voice of the expert who looked like a child he had seen once before. As expected, I guessed right. What they're doing is completely under the control of the ruler. The ruler is using their power to achieve a certain goal. Jian Bin's eyes shone, and the power in his body surged wildly. The strands of mixed ideas that he came into contact with continued to spread out, constantly coming into contact with everything in this world, trying to communicate and trying to resonate with everything in this world. This world had already shrunk to a radius of 1,000,000 miles, and its state was extremely unstable. The various fluctuations that were originally difficult to sense and the ideas hidden behind this world were now exposed like the mud at the bottom of the water. Touching and probing, it was tens of thousands of times easier than before. Chapter 2071. At this moment, an indescribable power appeared in Jian Bin's senses. "I've finally caught you." Jian Bin's heart flashed with extreme excitement, and his expression became ferocious. Immediately afterwards, waves of mysterious power, or in other words, mixed concepts, began to pour out of his body in a frenzy, trying to communicate with the indescribable and wondrous power that he sensed, which was the flat concept that had fused with this world. Heterogeneous ideas are, in essence, infinitely inferior to a flat idea. However, they were both concepts, after all, and belonged to the same general category. Communicating with each other was much easier than communicating with different powers. Thus, at this moment, with Jian Bin taking the initiative, this kind of communication was quickly established. The concept of the flatness of this world began to slowly condense towards the foundation from all directions. Gradually, it used his own heterogeneous concept as a bridge to continuously flow into his body. As the flat concept continued to pour in, Jian Bin's body began to undergo subtle changes. A wondrous feeling of being cared for by the heavens gradually emerged from the bottom of his heart. Even though this world was in the midst of a doomsday and felt as if it would completely collapse and be destroyed in an instant, it could not stop the mysterious multicolored light appearing around him. In this multicolored light, Jian Bin seemed more and more divine and mysterious. Immediately afterwards, boundless mysterious power continuously flowed out of Jian Bin's body and was shattered by the flat concept, annihilated, turned into nothingness, and finally completely erased. These mysterious powers were obviously the complex concepts that Jian Bin himself grasped. As these mixed concepts were expelled and erased, the flat concept of this world began to continuously fuse into his body. It gradually replaced the mixed concepts. It became the core of his power, the core of his cultivation, and the core of all his cultivation achievements. This process of replacing concepts was an incomparably painful process for any cultivator. During this process, he felt boundless pain completely drown him. That pain was so intense that it could not even be described as being cut by 1,000 knives. It was as if countless sharp blades were being used to pull out his spirit, incessantly cutting it from the inside out, grinding it to pieces, and washing it over and over again. Under this kind of pain, even if Jianbin was the successor of the Tao Master, he still couldn't bear it. He could not help but cry out in pain. Right now, he could be said to have fused with the world. Such a loud roar easily affected the entire world, creating ripples that spread out in all directions. Moreover, the roar was so loud that it seemed like it could easily affect the entire world, creating ripples that spread out in all directions. As a second tribulation expert of the second level of the Tao Master's path, such an existence already possessed unfathomable divine abilities. Even his voice contained boundless might. In other words, just the voice itself was enough to create endless phenomenons, and it could even change the world. At this moment, he combined the close connection between this world and him, letting the voice actively trigger the rule of law, energy, matter, and even space-time in this world. The effect was even more incredible. At this moment, the intact space-time within a radius of 1,000,000 miles suddenly collapsed. All the rule of law, energy, matter, and even space-time itself were shattered by the voice. They were replaced by the space-time evolved by the voice, by the power contained in it, and by the rule of law that was created within it. Furthermore, this replacement was not only limited to this intact region, but also spread out in all directions without holding back. It blasted into the boundless chaos in the surroundings, replacing the shattered space-time in the surroundings. For these intact regions, this change was a form of destruction. For those regions that had already been destroyed, this change was a form of opening up from nothing. It was the most fundamental form of salvation. If there was a legend in the future, in this intact area, Jianbin's painful roar might be regarded as a means of destroying the world. And in the vast chaos region, this roar of pain would be regarded as the voice of the Creator God who was saving the world. At this moment, the pain that Jianbin endured was endless, almost like a surging river, and there was no sign of it subsiding. This kind of pain caused him to roar continuously after that painful roar. This was like an extremely strong, ordinary person who encountered some kind of pain. If he continued to endure his pain and did not cry out, it was very likely that he would not cry out in the end. However, if he could not endure the pain any longer and finally let out a cry, then even if the pain afterwards was similar to before, he would not be able to hold it in any longer, and his cries might be even more miserable than those of the weaker people. At this moment, what was happening to Jianbin was not much different from that of the ordinary person. The roars of pain were continuously released. The power brought about by the voice and the world resonated with his voice. It started to change the entire world, making it seem as if the world had experienced apocalyptic disasters again and again. It was completely destroyed, only to be reborn again, and then rebuilt again and again. At this moment, more than a dozen flat concepts appeared in this world that was constantly being created and destroyed by the endless painful roar, and continued to penetrate into this world from more than a dozen positions in this world. To Jianbin's painful roar, their existence was like more than a dozen reefs appearing in the middle of a waterfall. They directly changed the surging state of these sound waves, and even changed the state of the world that these sound waves were born from. As a result, the world gradually began to change, and began to produce all kinds of mysterious and wonderful changes around these areas. Those more than a dozen positions. It was as if they had become more than a dozen incomparably flat mountain peaks. In other words, they were like mountains that had walked out of an abstract world. They directly appeared in the world that was constantly being created and destroyed, and began to produce a powerful absorption force. They frantically absorbed the energy, matter, time, space, and even laws of the surrounding sound waves. This change, it continued to expand. It continued to increase. In the end, the changes in more than a dozen positions finally intertwined and finally stabilized those areas, causing more than half of this world to be stabilized. Although it was constantly suffering the destruction and reconstruction of the sound waves, it was not as thorough as before. It was no longer completely destroyed and rebuilt, but only limited to the surface. This change, this lasted for several hundred years. After several hundred years, when the complex concepts in Jianbin's body were finally completely replaced by the flat concept, the endless pain finally completely disappeared from his body. Instead, it was replaced by an indescribable comfort and beauty. This comfort and beauty caused his body to gradually melt. It caused his body to gradually melt. Unknowingly, he had already melted into this world, and he could no longer be found. As he integrated into this world, the scene of the world that was constantly being destroyed and reborn due to his sound waves began to rapidly change. It was as if an invisible barrier had been removed, and an incomparably perfect, mysterious, and indescribably flat world was finally revealed. Time, space, matter, energy, laws, vitality, living beings, everything began to be reestablished. The entire world seemed as if it had gone through a horrifying calamity, and it revealed an even more peaceful aura than before, causing everyone to feel relaxed and happy within it. Just what happened? Does it have to be so painful to become a ruler? In the crude concept, Zheng Yi muttered with a blank expression. The entire process was simply unimaginably strange to him. According to the final outcome, Jianbin seemed to have become the ruler of this world and obtained the harvest that he had dreamed of. However, no matter what, it was a good thing. Why did he appear to be in so much pain throughout the entire process? Why did he let out such a miserable shriek? Even in this crude concept of time and space, they were actually affected and had to resist with all their might to avoid being injured. I don't understand. I don't understand. In the end, he could only helplessly admit that his knowledge was far from enough. He could not understand what was going on at all. Just when they thought that the matter was over and everything was about to return to normal, the dozen or so abstract mountains began to tremble violently. Boundless, terrifying auras began to emerge from the mountains, and they began to spread out in all directions. The auras fused with the world's power, laws, and even space-time. In the end, they evolved into countless living beings that frantically spread out in all directions. In just a few years, they had come into contact with each other. As a result, an extremely tragic war erupted. The living beings that were born from the dozen or so abstract mountains seemed to have an irreconcilable hatred for each other. They wanted to chew and devour the other living beings, and they killed each other mercilessly. Shocking destructive power wreaked havoc in this part of the world. The world that had just recovered a few years ago was once again plunged into the apocalypse. The creatures that had just been born in this part of the world once again felt the instinctive fear that had been deeply engraved in the depths of their lives. Killing intent, resentment, and killing intent kept accumulating in this part of the world at an extremely fast speed. Tribulation. Suddenly, a sigh that Zheng Yi and the others were inexplicably familiar with rang out from nowhere and spread throughout the world. Tribulation. Zheng Ye's heart trembled at this moment, and his eyes were filled with confusion at first. Then, this confusion quickly turned into a kind of sudden enlightenment, as if he had understood many things that he did not know before. Weren't the various scenes that had appeared in this world in the past the scenes of the arrival of the tribulation? Weren't the scenes in front of him the manifestation of the endless expansion of the tribulation? Just as he was thinking about this, a figure appeared out of thin air in front of them. Who else could it be but Jianbin? At this moment, Jianbin looked very different from before. Back then, Jianbin felt a little unfathomable. But in the end, they could still feel that he was much stronger than them. But now, they could no longer sense the aura of the Jianbin in front of them, nor could they sense just how strong he was. Perhaps it was as they had sensed that he was just an ordinary person. "You become a ruler?" Zheng Yi asked instinctively. Jianbin's expression changed. When he heard this, his expression changed. His eyes flashed with a hint of fear. Perhaps Zheng Yi and the others were just imagining things, but they felt as if he was sweating cold sweat. "It must be a mistake. It must be a mistake." After a long while, Jianbin smiled bitterly. "That's right. I have indeed become a ruler of this world. But you saw the process, and I don't want to remember that feeling for the rest of my life. Why is it like this? There are tens of millions of rulers in this strange landscape, but I've never heard that becoming a ruler is so painful." Zheng Yi exclaimed, "Because they were chosen by the heavens. And me, I took it by force. That's why it went so smoothly for them, and they didn't feel the slightest bit of pain. But I had to suffer unimaginable torture," Jianbin said with a rather unsightly expression. This unsightly expression was clearly not directed at Zheng Yi. Rather, it was directed at what had happened to him in the past. Seeing him like this, although Zheng Yi and the others still didn't understand, they knew that they couldn't ask any further. After all, judging from Jianbin's expression, the fact that he was able to answer them to this extent meant that he valued their deep friendship at that moment. Zheng Yi changed the topic. "What's going on now? Why is there such a tribulation?" When Jianbin heard this, a strange smile appeared on his face. He seemed to be rejoicing in someone else's misfortune, and he said, "This is the sin of those 16 seniors. I was only forced to become the ruler of this world, and I already had to suffer such a severe punishment. They actually want to strip away the origin of this world." The expressions of Zheng Yi and the others changed drastically. In their eyes, forcibly becoming the ruler of a world was already an incredibly extravagant act. But now, they actually heard that a cultivator was actually challenging this world and wanted to strip away the world's essence. This was practically toppling their worldview. If that was all, they would at most think that those cultivators were overestimating themselves. However, looking at the drastic changes in this world, their efforts seem to have been rather successful. At the very least, it was enough to provoke this world to punish them. Since this is their punishment, why did they trigger the tribulation of this world? Zheng Yi suddenly thought of something and hurriedly asked, "Who said that this tribulation is their punishment?" Jianbin asked doubtfully. Zheng Yi was slightly taken aback. Didn't Jianbin say that? However, he soon understood. Jianbin had only said that these were the sins they had committed. It didn't seem to say that this tribulation was their punishment at all. This tribulation is only caused by them to recover from the losses they suffered after the punishment. In fact, their will, power, and origin of life have been divided into trillions of parts by this world and integrated into the world. They're only doing this to reunite the parts that have been separated, Jianbin said with a smile. Divided into trillions of parts and suppressed separately. Even though they were already at the second tribulation, Zheng Yi and the others couldn't help but shiver at this moment. This kind of punishment was simply insane. Just imagining themselves being divided into trillions of parts and integrated into a world was enough to make their hearts tremble. They couldn't even imagine what the cultivators who were truly suffering this kind of punishment were feeling right now. There seems to be a change. Jianbin's expression suddenly changed as he said this. Immediately afterwards, an indescribable light shone in his eyes. An indescribable pressure emanated from his body, forcing Zheng Yi and the others to retreat. Right at this moment, an indescribable fluctuation suddenly appeared in this part of the world. It swiftly swept across the eternal world along the endless transportation network in the outside world, and in the blink of an eye, it had already entered the countless trillions of worlds within the eternal world. How tragic. Jianbin's expression stiffened as he murmured to himself. The pressure released from his body gradually converged, and not long after, it completely disappeared. "What's wrong?" Zheng Yi recovered and asked curiously. I originally thought that their separated parts had only integrated into this part of the world. Who would have thought? Jin Ben shook his head as he spoke and continued with a somewhat sympathetic expression. Who would have thought that their separated parts had already integrated into almost all of the worlds through the transportation network? So you're saying that they can't ever recover? Zheng Ye's expression was a little strange. There seemed to be some sympathy, but there seemed to be some other thoughts hidden in his heart. This kind of scale is no longer something I can see through, Jin Ben sighed. At this moment, he once again felt a strong sense of wariness towards the ruler of this phenomenon. If it really was as he had thought, that all of this was within the ruler's control, then the ruler's methods were simply too inconceivable. Chapter 2072. Xingye's expression changed slightly when he heard Jin Ben's words. The best experience of reading a novel was a great loss. Even though he had become a ruler, Jin Ben still felt a little regretful when he saw the cracks on the stones. He sighed and put the stones away. With a wave of his hand, he brought Xingye and the others to a certain deep layer of space-time in this world. This place was extremely close to the space-time where the boy and the others had tried to refine the concept of the world's flatness. However, it was only close. It was still not that space-time. This kind of geographical location allowed one to sense the flatness that belonged to this part of space and time more intensely than any other location. However, it wasn't enough to truly affect the concept of the world's flatness. It wasn't enough to give Xingye and the others a chance to refine it. This was naturally Jin Ben's own cautiousness at work. After going through trials and tribulations together, Jin Ben and Xingye's relationship had become quite different. Their friendship had become much deeper. However, no matter how deep their friendship was, he wouldn't casually open up the core space-time where he had become a ruler. The fact that he had given this place to Xingye and the others to cultivate showed how much he valued their friendship. This space-time was at an extremely high position in this world. If one looked down from here, one could clearly see the entire world at a glance. In other words, one could see from here. However, he was able to see through the development of the tribulation in this world with a single glance. Although it wasn't as clear and intuitive as it was in the core space-time at the highest level, when Jin Ben moved them here, the war in this part of the world became even more intense. The slaughter had become more and more desperate. The laws of this world had been unknowingly affected by the war and began to undergo all sorts of subtle changes. At the same time, outside the world that everyone couldn't see, in other parts of the eternal world, a subtle change was gradually occurring. At first, it was just a small disturbance that affected a very small area. However, with the passage of time, in just a few decades, this extremely small chaos had already developed to a scale of millions. From the original small-scale conflict, it had turned into a grand war. The number of affected creatures went from hundreds of thousands of people in a small area to hundreds of millions of people. If such a change had only occurred in one part of the world, it would not have attracted much attention. After all, every world was so vast, and it was extremely normal for a war to break out somewhere within it. However, this sort of change affected practically every part of the world. In other words, in the countless trillions of worlds within the eternal world, battles of this scale were happening at almost the same time and rhythm. This caused others to be unable to take it as a coincidence. However, all of these wars had one thing in common. That was, some kind of ripple had swept through this world before. In other words, a part of the bodies of the 16 cultivators who dared to fight against this world had been thrown into it. To say that there was no connection would be an insult to one's intelligence. These wars were becoming more and more intense with every passing moment, and the conflicts that caused the wars were intensifying with every passing moment. The entire process seemed to be limitless, and all the changes seemed to be able to develop endlessly. Time passed bit by bit. Unknowingly, 1,000 years had passed. The war that was originally limited to a corner of the world had unknowingly spread to every affected world, causing the worlds that had been infused with a portion of the bodies of the 16 cultivators to fall into a full-scale war. In other words, they had fallen into a kind of war. In the first few hundred years, no cultivators paid attention to this change. After all, no matter how this war developed, it was only limited to the secular world. At most, it would only affect the cultivation world. For those cultivators who had become rulers or pursued rulers from the second level of the Tao Master Path, it was nothing at all. It had no effect on them. But, as time passed, the scale of the war expanded endlessly. When the entire world was finally enveloped in that iron-blooded killing intent, they had no choice but to pay attention to it, even if they didn't want to. When they began to pay attention at this time, they found that this war was no longer something they could stop. The originally small-scale conflicts had already unknowingly developed into a super-powerful calamity for the entire eternal world. It had developed into an extremely powerful calamity for the entire eternal world. The calamity that was originally limited to a single world had unknowingly crossed over the world and connected with the transportation network, making it impossible for any cultivator in any world to deal with it independently. When these tribulations were chained together, their power suddenly skyrocketed countless times. In the end, an independent existence that was close to a will was born to control these tribulations as a whole. These tribulations began to spread towards other worlds that were originally unaffected by them. It constantly swallowed the worlds into this calamity, causing an earth-shattering war to break out in those worlds. It caused the conflicts that had accumulated for countless years to explode. Among them, the one that had the greatest impact was the flat world. For calamity, although 1,000 years was not short, it was not long either. However, for the creatures in this world, this 1,000 years was so long that they could not even dream of it. It was the same for cultivators like Zheng Yi, who had entered from the second level of the Tao Master Path. During this 1,000 years, the entire world repeatedly demonstrated the destruction of heaven and earth, the creation and rebirth of the world, and the destruction of heaven and earth. The entire process of recreation and rebirth compared to the orderly expansion and growth of the wars in other worlds, the situation in this flat world was completely different. The development of war in this world was countless times faster than in other worlds. In the short span of a decade, it had already developed to the point where the world had completely collapsed, falling into a state where the laws, matter, energy, and space-time of the entire world were in complete chaos. Normally speaking, at this point, the conflicts in the entire world should have been completely vented. For this world, the 16 cultivators who had been completely separated into billions of parts by this world should have already regathered those parts of their bodies. In other words, this world should have already passed the calamity and should have stepped into a great process of rebirth after the calamity. However, it was a pity that things did not develop as those cultivators had imagined. It was as if some kind of power had poured in from outside the world after the destruction of this world, allowing this world to be reborn and reborn, evolving all things in the world, evolving into extraordinary beings, and evolving into infinite life. After that, before the world had completely stabilized, the 16 cultivators cried out once more. Their bodies were cut apart once more and melted into the world once more. Similarly, a portion of them flowed through the transportation network in the outside world and into the infinite world within the eternal world. As a result, those cultivators had no choice but to start another war and work hard to reunite the parts of their bodies that had fused with the entire world. The cycle repeated itself over and over again, like an endless loop. This was because every cycle would send a portion of their body parts out of this world and fuse with other worlds. Unknowingly, the 16 cultivators' rationality had gradually deteriorated. In the end, they had even lost the ability to think and could only instinctively use the program that they had set up in the beginning. They started a war again and again, worked hard to reunite their bodies, and failed again and again. At this point, how could Jingye and the others not understand why Jianban had stopped them back then? If we had tried to seize their essence of cultivation back then, wouldn't we be the ones in this situation now? Jingye could not help but feel a lingering fear when he thought of this. Amidst this lingering fear, he also felt an indescribable sense of gratitude towards Jianban. If Jianbin had not stopped him back then, he might really have done something like that on this day. Jianbin appeared and came to their side. This time, your chance has come. Hearing this, the expressions of Zhengye and the others changed slightly. With Jianbin's previous accurate judgment, they were much more confident in him. Hearing this, they instinctively felt a strong sense of anticipation. What chance? Zhengye hurriedly asked. This time, the calamity has finally affected every part of the world within the phenomenon, Jianbin said with a smile. Hearing this, Zhengye and the others' expressions changed slightly. After all, they were not the rulers of this part of the world, and their vision was naturally limited to this part of the world. Although they knew that many changes were occurring outside of this part of the world, they did not know how serious it was. Only now, after Jianbin said this, did they understand that the calamity that had stirred up in this part of the world was actually so terrifying. It had actually affected so many worlds. And then, what does this have to do with us? Zhengye hurriedly asked expectantly. The calamity is indeed a disaster for all living beings. However, for us, it is a great opportunity. In the calamity, everything in the world is changing, and the mysterious power that has fused with the origin of the world is in an unprecedented state of activity. Jianbin did not continue, but Zhengye and the others already understood what he meant, and their faces turned slightly red. Their faces turned slightly red, and their eyes were filled with an indescribable fanaticism. When the mysterious power became active, it naturally became easier to sense it. If one wanted to fuse with it, it would naturally become many times easier than usual. In other words, in this kind of calamity, it would be many times easier to become the ruler of a certain part of the world. In fact, even if one was not compatible with the world, it did not seem impossible to forcefully become the ruler of a certain part of the world. Jianbin was the best proof. Looks like you all understand. Jianbin looked at them and said with a smile, "Thank you for your guidance, fellow Taoist. If we become successful in the future, we will not forget your kindness today." Zhengye and the others directly said to Jianbin at this moment in an extremely serious manner. Hearing this, Jianbin smiled and said, "All right, there's no need to say anything else. Now, you all should quickly take action. Although this convenience has only been spread among a few cultivators, it will not be limited for too long. Very soon, all the cultivators will know about it, so you all have to act quickly to prevent others from beating you to it." Although it was only a guess, Jianbin's tone was unprecedentedly certain, as if he had already obtained proof of this guess from another aspect. When everyone heard this, they naturally became even more anxious and nodded one after another. As for why Jianbin was so certain and why he seemed to be stating a fact, they did not have any interest in finding out. With a single thought, the world in everyone's eyes began to undergo a huge change. Originally, the scene inside the world in their eyes began to fade in an instant and was replaced by the scene outside the world. In the extremely vast space, the stars were strung together by extremely wondrous bands of light, forming an incomparably huge network. It was an extremely mysterious scene of heaven and earth. Although you can't directly sense that mysterious power, using the world as a medium, you will still be able to sense which part of the world is most compatible with you. Now, all of you should carefully sense it and choose the most suitable world. This voice directly entered everyone's ears, but they no longer cared about who was speaking, much less the content of the words. At this moment, they were all stunned by the strange scene in front of them. Using the world as a medium to view the interior of the eternal world was a completely different experience than using their own eyes to view it. The scene before them, which displayed the essence of the world without holding back, was like completely removing the fog that had previously shrouded their eyes. It allowed them to understand the composition of the world inside the eternal world like never before. They could also sense the essence of the world with unprecedented clarity and understand how compatible they were with it. This kind of shocking scene caused them to be completely immersed in it in an instant. Compared to the joy they felt as if they had struck the jackpot, Jianbin was in a lot of pain. Even for hegemons, It was virtually impossible for them to directly reflect the true nature of heaven and earth. The only reason he could do it now was because the world was currently undergoing a tribulation. The mysterious power within, in other words, the concept that Luo Fan had fused with the world, had become incredibly active, and more traces of it were revealed. However, even with this convenience, trying to turn the impossible into the possible still took an unimaginable toll on him. It could be said that at this moment, he could feel the entire world emitting gurgling sounds. He could feel the powerful rebounding force that was constantly being transmitted to his body, and he could feel that his mental strength was being consumed at an unimaginably terrifying rate. Chapter 2074. Latest news. Tomorrow is 515, Chidian's anniversary celebration. It's the day with the most benefits. Apart from the gift bags and school bags, the 515 red packets were also a must. There was no reason not to snatch them. Set the alarm clock. Could this be the ruler's blessing? Jian Bin's expression was rather complicated. As the second disciple of the Tao Master who could immediately see through Luo Fan's plans, and even act decisively, how could Jian Bin's intelligence be weak? At this moment, when he felt the changes in his body, he suddenly understood what was going on. He knew why he suddenly had such a change. He did not do anything special at this moment. It was impossible for his cultivation to improve and increase in cultivation to cause such a result. Since it wasn't him, then he could only obtain some benefits from some other existence. No matter how he thought about it, in this eternal world, who else could give him such benefits other than that existence that had always been looking down at all the changes in this world from an extremely high vantage point? After thinking this through, he was naturally even more certain that his choice was in line with that ruler's intentions. As for his current complex emotions, there was no need to say much. As the second disciple of the Tao Master, he had the mentality of viewing all other cultivators as inferior, wandering cultivators. But now, he had obtained the blessing of that self-proclaimed wandering cultivator and received benefits from him. How could he not feel complicated? No matter what, as long as I have enough benefits, it's enough for me to ascend. In the end, he steeled his resolve once more, and his expression became calm once more. He looked around, his vision piercing through the barriers of this part of the world that he was the ruler of, and saw the countless worlds within the eternal world. Currently, more than 30% of the worlds in the eternal world had been affected by the tribulations. Although it was only 30%, this number had already reached a terrifying level that numbers couldn't even begin to describe. There were so many worlds. Even if there were hundreds of billions of cultivators who had entered this part of the world, no, there were hundreds of billions of them, and every single one of them was distributed to a world. There was probably more than enough to spare. If it was just to let those foreign cultivators become hegemons, there would be no need for him to cause such a large-scale tribulation. That's why the sovereign's intentions aren't as simple as they seem. Jian Bin thought to himself, a thought that had only grown clearer and clearer over the years. If he wasn't sure if his idea was correct before then, after receiving the sovereign's blessing, his connection to this world grew stronger and stronger, and he became more and more certain that his thoughts were correct. He immediately swept his gaze towards the worlds that hadn't been affected by the tribulation. Those worlds occupied 70% of the countless trillions of worlds within the eternal world. However, at this moment, they seemed to be in a precarious situation, as if they could collapse at any time when they were surrounded by the 30% of worlds affected by the tribulation. The tribulations in every world seemed to be attracted by a black hole, and they began to spread towards the worlds that were not affected by the tribulations at all times. Many worlds were pulled into the tribulations, providing power for the tribulations to spread, causing more and more worlds to fall into their fate and sink into the tribulations. With a thought in his mind, the tribulations of this world that he ruled over began to change direction. He directly targeted the worlds that had not been affected by the tribulations. As he turned around, the situation of the entire world underwent a subtle change. The body parts that had been removed from the bodies of the 16 cultivators began to change directions. Instead of spreading out wantonly, it turned into a beam of light that shot towards a fixed target. Under such a transformation, the strength and penetrating power of the body parts spread. Naturally, it was many times faster than before. At this rate, it'll take at least 100,000 years to pull all the heavens and earth into the tribulation, Jin Ben thought to himself. However, these 16 cultivators can only last for 100 years at most. If this continues, I'm afraid it'll be difficult for this tribulation to pull the entire world into it. Then, he frowned again. The 16 cultivators had used a special method to forcefully reach the level of a ruler. They were so powerful that they surpassed most rulers in the eternal world. They were many times stronger than ordinary second tribulation cultivators. Even the current Jin Ben dared not say that he could defeat any one of them. However, these 16 cultivators were only second tribulation cultivators, and there were only 16 of them. No matter how strong they were insignificant compared to the eternal world. It was obvious that using their body parts to trigger the tribulations of the eternal world couldn't go on indefinitely. There would come a day when their body parts would be used up, making it difficult for the tribulations to continue spreading. Jin Ben felt a headache coming on. If the 16 cultivators' body parts were used up and could no longer spread, Jin Ben thought that the tribulations would naturally find it difficult to spread. If the tribulations couldn't spread, didn't that mean that his guess was wrong? Didn't that mean that the ruler had no intention of pulling the entire world into the tribulations? This clearly didn't match up to the various signs from before. In the end, my intelligence still can't compare to that ruler's. Although I've guessed part of his plan, it's still difficult for me to know the whole truth. In the end, he could only helplessly admit that he wasn't capable enough. He was now able to accept this kind of admission of failure, which he'd hated so much in the past. If this was in the past, such as when he just stepped into the eternal world, admitting that he was inferior to a wandering cultivator would have been akin to killing him. If he'd been in the same situation back then, he would have come up with countless excuses. He might have even claimed that the ruler who'd caused the phenomenon was a disciple of a Tao sovereign. He wouldn't have acted like he did right now, merely acting a little helpless. Just as he was feeling helpless, he sensed the connection being transmitted to him through the connection between heaven and earth. He immediately knew that it was the cultivators he'd sent out earlier. As expected, even though some are faster and some are slower, they've all become rulers in the end. His heart was filled with excitement. With the help of these rulers, they were no longer without a foundation in the eternal world. They seemed to be able to have their own say in the overall situation of the world. At that moment, he immediately cast aside all his previous thoughts and began to connect with these cultivators. These cultivators more or less knew how to be grateful. When the conditions were equal, they would naturally first consider the foundation that had done them a great favor. As such, the foundation didn't need to spend much effort. He had already formed an alliance with them and directly connected the 10 worlds together. He once again split up the 16 cultivators and sent them into the various worlds, turning them into the source of the tribulations. Under the guidance of the foundation, the tribulations spread even faster to the worlds that had not yet been affected by the tribulations, drawing even more worlds into the tribulations. Because the source of the tribulations had increased, the 16 cultivators' bodies naturally wore out much faster than before. According to the Foundation's calculations, it would have taken 100 years before the cultivators could no longer support themselves and continue to disperse. After expanding the source, it had only been a short 30 years, but the 16 cultivators had already turned into oil lamps that were about to be extinguished. Every time they collapsed, it became slower and slower, and the amount of body parts that could be retracted became fewer and fewer. In the end, at a certain moment, they finally reached their limit. After all the cultivators collapsed, they could no longer condense the formations, mountains, seas, islands, and even magic treasures that suppressed the 16 cultivators in the 10 directions. All of them lost their effects at the same time. The mountain collapsed, the sea dissipated, the magic treasures returned to the sovereign, and the island turned into nothingness. all kinds of things. All of this indicated that the 16 cultivators would never be able to return, can't hold on anymore. Jian Ben sighed in his heart, but he was also filled with indescribable anticipation. He sighed because the 16 powerful cultivators had been scattered across the boundless world, and there was almost no chance for them to reunite in the future. It could be said that he was completely dead. On the other hand, he was looking forward to the fact that the path of expansion of the tribulations he understood had been severed. In that case, how would the sovereign continue with the tribulations? What methods would he use that he could not understand to continue with his plan? No matter what the sovereign's plan was, no matter what actions the sovereign would take, as long as he thought about how he could not understand it, Jian Ben was filled with intense anticipation. He wanted to see the changes quickly. Fellow Taoist, what should we do next? Zheng Yi asked Jian Ben through voice transmission. Although he could see many things that he couldn't see clearly with the help of his sovereign status, he couldn't guess Luo fans' thoughts like Jian Ben. At this point, he was already a loss and didn't know what to do next. The other cultivators who had become sovereigns with Jian Ben's help also pricked up their ears to listen to Jian Ben, wanting to know what he had to say. "We wait," Jian Ben said directly. "Wait." These words were beyond Jingye and the others' expectations. At this moment, all of them were puzzled. They did not understand what Jian Ben meant at all. Wait? Wait for what? Were they supposed to wait for the tribulations to pass before proceeding with the next step of their plan? They pondered to themselves. At this time, more than 40% of the eternal world had been affected by the tribulations. These 40% of the eternal world struggled continuously, and from time to time, a part of the world would be overturned. Apart from its foundation, the entire world would be destroyed, and it would have to start anew. As for the remaining 60% of the world, although it was surrounded by the 40% and was constantly being eroded by it, the rate at which it was being eroded was growing slower and slower. It seemed it was already heading towards safety and peace. An increasingly obvious, auspicious aura spread out from the 60% of the world, and it began to spread. It would gradually affect the countless trillions of worlds within the eternal world, pulling them out of the tribulations. If things continued like this, the tribulations would only grow smaller and smaller. In the end, the entire tribulations would pass, and the eternal world would return to how it was before the tribulations descended, even though it had only been 30 years. During these 30 years, close to 10 billion cultivators had seized the opportunity to become rulers of a certain world. Only an extremely small number of them had managed to find a world that was most compatible with them. They had only endured the pain of having their own world replace their own for a short period of time. The vast majority of sovereigns had to suffer for at least a dozen years before they became sovereigns. In fact, the difference between the world they had chosen and themselves was simply too great. Now that more than 30 years had passed, they were still in the same torment for the cultivators who had overcome the torment and become rulers. Passing the tribulations, naturally, did not affect them at all. However, for the cultivators who were still suffering and trying to become rulers in a certain world, the slowing down of the tribulations was akin to grabbing their lifeblood and cutting off their future prospects. For a time, an atmosphere of anxiety and irritation began to spread throughout the eternal world. More and more cultivators began to discuss how to expand the tribulations and how to keep them going. As more and more cultivators joined in, they came up with ideas one after another. However, it was clear that these cultivators didn't have a ruler among them. Thus, their view of this world was limited to a certain category. Under these circumstances, it was natural that they couldn't come up with a method that not even Jian Ben could think of to continue the tribulations of this world. Because of this lack of action, the atmosphere of irritation grew even more intense. In this state of irritation, they began to act recklessly, using whatever methods they could think of to kill in the undamaged worlds. They began to create their own tribulations with all their might, hoping to use this method to expand the tribulations. The situation within the eternal world grew more and more chaotic as a result of these changes. Amidst the chaos, the rulers watched the changes with cold eyes. Their eyes were filled with pity. Among them, Jianbin was the one who felt the most pity. However, he could already vaguely see where the ruler of the strange landscape was going to make his move, even if it was the Void Realm. In truth, he still couldn't see what exactly the ruler was going to do. "Let me see the true nature of the tribulations," Jianbin murmured. His perception had already reached its peak, and he paid close attention to the subtle changes that were about to take place in the eternal world. Just as he was paying close attention, the entire world finally changed. From the tens of billions of cultivators who'd plunged into the undamaged worlds to slaughter, all sorts of miraculous changes began to take place around them. An indescribable sense of rejection. It was born from the world and acted on the cultivators. This kind of rejection appeared without a trace, and it was completely integrated into the resistance of the world towards those cultivators, causing those cultivators to unknowingly fall into a state of rejection. Their emotions became more and more agitated, and their desire to kill also became stronger and stronger. In the end, at a certain moment, the rejection finally grew to a point where the cultivators could not endure it anymore. It directly destroyed the cultivators and tore their bodies into pieces, merging with the world. Only then did the cultivators come to their senses and realize what they'd done. However, although he had woken up, it was still too late. In the end, they only left behind a little bit of their spiritual consciousness, which was thrown into the reincarnation cycle of that world and gradually merged with it. Because the eternal world was now in an indescribable, special environment. The addition of these spiritual consciousnesses had triggered a change that had never been possible before. A special characteristic that should not have appeared in that part of the world finally appeared in that part of the world. From then on, the creatures born in that part of the world had a transcendent aura that should not have existed in that part of the world. This situation happened in billions of worlds. This entire world was a complete system. Although it looked chaotic, it followed a higher level of order and formed a whole. At this time, the world had undergone such a subtle change. Naturally, it caused the entire eternal world to undergo a subtle change. And when this subtle change spread out, it finally triggered a change in the second layer of the Tao Master's path. For a time, in the void outside the eternal world, from the endless strange scenes around it, some mysterious existence began to gather towards the eternal world. It constantly seeped into it and began to trigger a new round of change in the eternal world. This new round of change first appeared in the worlds that gave birth to beings with transcendent auras, causing these worlds to change in all sorts of subtle and indescribable ways. An even more untraceable tribulation began to be born in these worlds. Soon after, the tribulation began to spread in an even more mysterious manner. In the blink of an eye, it had already spread to the countless trillions of worlds in the eternal world, causing the same signs of the tribulation to appear in those countless trillions of worlds. At this time, Jianbin, who was watching all this, was completely stunned. Chapter 2075. To think that it would be so extravagant. I'm still a frog at the bottom of a well after all. This was the only thought in Jianbin's mind at that moment. Although he had already made a very high estimate of the ruler's extravagance, and he even had some confidence in it, he had never thought that it would be so extravagant. It was not as he had imagined, that it was not limited to the interior of the phenomenon, but through various extremely ingenious changes, it had drawn upon the power of the entire second layer of the Tao Sovereign's path, and used the overall power of the second layer to achieve its goal. At this time, every single one of the billions of worlds within the eternal world had been affected by the tribulation. The transformation that Jianbin had originally thought would take hundreds of thousands of years to complete had been completed in just a few breaths' time. Moreover, compared to the tribulations triggered by the 16 cultivators, the tribulations that descended from the second layer of the Tao Sovereign's path were more absolute, more powerful, and more impossible to resist. If the rulers could be said to be able to stay out of the tribulations triggered by the 16 cultivators in the past due to their special authority, then this new tribulation made them feel the might of that tribulation. It made them vaguely understand that they were also in the midst of a tribulation, and if they were not careful, They could also be turned into ashes at this moment. Jin Ben was not worried about his own situation. On the contrary, countless ideas constantly flickered in the depths of his mind. In a trance, he seemed to have comprehended many mysteries that he had previously found difficult to comprehend, or even unimaginable. It was as if a completely different world had opened up before his eyes. Along with his various inspirations and comprehensions, a faintly discernible figure gradually walked out of his body. After this faintly discernible figure walked out, it very quickly began to devour the concepts that existed in this flat world and began to rapidly enrich itself. It rapidly completed the process of evolving from illusion to reality. Not long after, it had already formed a body that was almost the same as his own. This was not an avatar, but a manifestation of his will that belonged to this part of the world. After this manifestation of concepts appeared, Jin Ben felt his mind become empty, and an indescribable sense of satisfaction welled up in him. Under this sense of satisfaction, he came back to his senses and discovered the existence of the will incarnation. He also realized that the power of his divine art was more than 100 times stronger than before. With a slight thought, this consciousness incarnation had already stepped out of this world and started to rapidly expand. In the blink of an eye, it had grown from the size of an ordinary person to the size of the entire world. Standing on the transportation network, it could almost be compared to the nodes of the transportation network. In other words, it was a piece of heaven and earth. When the incarnation appeared, it naturally triggered a change in the entire eternal world. Some mysterious existence attached itself to the incarnation, giving Jin Ben an epiphany. In this enlightenment, the will incarnation began to walk towards the depths of the eternal world. In other words, it was the heart of the world where Luo Fan sat cross-legged in the outside world. At this moment, as if they were being guided by him, the incarnations of will appeared on the transportation network and strode towards the heart of the eternal world. Along the way, more and more concept incarnations met each other. An indescribable atmosphere began to spread among them. It seemed to be vigilant, hostile, and indescribably vigilant. These concept incarnations naturally came from the rulers of the world. The reason the rulers were heading in that direction was because they could vaguely sense that the greatest opportunity of this calamity lay in that direction. As long as they obtained that opportunity, they might be able to take another step forward. As for where exactly they would be able to take another step forward, they all had some idea, but none of them dared to confirm it. However, no matter what that step forward represented, as long as there was a chance to take another step forward, as powerful cultivators who sought to become rulers in the eternal world, they couldn't give up on it no matter what. The void inside the eternal world was vast and boundless, but it clearly wasn't an obstacle for these incomparably huge concept incarnations. In just a few short days, millions of concept incarnations had already gathered around the heart. These concept incarnations densely surrounded the area where the heart was located. When they saw that the area was completely empty, they all sank in hesitation. These millions of concept incarnations didn't represent all the concept incarnations in the eternal world. In other words, in reality, there were still a large number of rulers who hadn't sent their concept incarnations here. However, even though it was only a small portion of them, their existence had already created a strong influence. They formed a practically absolute barrier for other cultivators, turning this originally ordinary area into a forbidden area for cultivators. It became a place that no existence other than concept incarnations could enter. The influence of this area grew stronger and stronger, and its effects grew deeper and deeper. Gradually, the region where the heart was located began to undergo all sorts of subtle changes. Indistinctly, illusory figures appeared out of nowhere in this region. These illusory figures were like worlds that were constantly overlapping, forming a scene that grew more and more complex. Moreover, this increasingly complex scene became more and more realistic as time passed. It was as if they were finally going to create a new world. What is the purpose of this? Jin Ben was puzzled at this moment. However, With the repeated blows and the repeated slaps to his face, he no longer made baseless guesses at this moment. He just wholeheartedly waited for such a change to appear, waiting for the existence that he felt was very likely to be a fortuitous encounter to appear. The other concept incarnations had the same thoughts as Jianben. They were somewhat different. This also caused their performances to be different from one another. Millions of concept incarnations were practically the cornerstone of a complete civilization. So many concept incarnations were gathered here. Gradually, they began to communicate with each other. And with communication, order was naturally formed. In just a few short years, this place had become a settlement in the void, the embodiment of many ideals. Or perhaps it should be said that a holy land where the rulers interacted. Many rulers communicated with each other here. Many hegemons had found friends, enemies, and even Tao companions in this place. If things continued like this, it was possible that this place would eventually become an established social circle for rulers. But obviously, how could the situation go on forever? After all, the eternal world was currently in the midst of a tribulation. Rulers like them were also in the midst of a tribulation. They couldn't transcend it. They should have been surprised that there were a few years of peace. How could the situation continue to be peaceful? On this day, a type of tribulation power appeared out of nowhere. Suddenly, out of nowhere, it appeared out of thin air in the middle of the complex, illusory image that they had gathered. The appearance of this tribulation power altered the very nature of the illusory world, turning it from illusory into reality. In fact, it was transforming into something that surpassed everything else in the world. An indescribable feeling welled up in the hearts of the rulers. My opportunity lies in there. Almost all the sovereigns instantly understood what they had been waiting for all this time. At that moment, the circle that was gradually taking shape collapsed with a loud bang. All the consciousness incarnations were thrown into the world that was becoming more and more vast and real. In the end, it even surpassed all the other worlds. This world wasn't perfect yet. Even with the help of tribulation power, the world seemed crude and crude in the eyes of the rulers. However, it was precisely this crudeness that made it easier for them to see through the nature of this world and come into contact with its secrets. This place contains the power of other worlds. Any ruler can become the ruler of this world. Then, they can borrow this status to control the other worlds with power equal to this world. They can become rulers above the other rulers. All of the rulers instantly understood this. Once they understood this, all of the concept incarnations went crazy. After all, becoming rulers was a great thing for them. They were able to distinguish themselves among the cultivators of the second layer of the path of Tao sovereigns, and they were even on the verge of ascension, all because they'd been lucky enough to become rulers of a world. If becoming a ruler of a world was enough to bring them close to ascension, what kind of benefits would there be for becoming a ruler above the ruler level? Would he ascend directly, or would he ascend with his own heaven and earth, or would he ascend directly to the fourth level, or even the fifth level? Not a single ruler could be sure of any of these possibilities. However, every single overlord knew that if they obtained the status of an overlord that reigned supreme over the other overlords, then they would definitely obtain unimaginable benefits in the end. Moreover, the benefits would definitely give them a pleasant surprise. With this in mind, how could they not crazily desire to become rulers of this world? Their desires were the fulcrum of their tribulations. Once they had desires, they had impulses. Tribulations had a point of strength. As a result, the tribulation power in this world naturally began to increase at a crazy rate. The world grew even faster as the changes occurred. In just a few short years, it had grown into an unimaginably colossus. It was like the sun of the eternal world. Its light radiated across the billions of worlds in this world, penetrating the barriers between them and illuminating their insides. The living beings in those worlds discovered that an even brighter and more dazzling sun had appeared in the sky. Moreover, it was a sun that shone day and night. This change, which defied nature, pushed the tribulations that had already been on the verge of insanity one step further. It caused the tribulations in the eternal world to grow even more violent. In the end, in just 100 years. In the end, in just a short 100 years. It was unknown how many trillions of worlds there were, but every single one of them had fallen into a tribulation. It could be said that apart from where Luo-Fan was, there were no other places in the eternal world that could transcend tribulations, all of the tribulation power. Moreover, they had already been completely linked together. After breaking free of the restraints of the world, they began to spread beyond the world. They flowed along the incredibly developed transportation network and quickly connected the trillions of tribulations in the eternal world. At this time, the 129,600 worlds that Luo-Fan had set his sights on had unwittingly become the center of the tribulations. They became a circulation point for the tribulation power, allowing it to flow more smoothly and faster. At the same time, it strengthened the tribulation power in the process. It caused the tribulation power to grow in a bizarre manner. As the tribulation power continued to circulate, the essence of every world began to circulate. In the end, it gathered towards the largest mass, where the tribulation power was the strongest. In other words, it was gathering towards the heart of the eternal world. The gathering of these essences brought endless disaster to the world and the heart, which was the new sun inside the eternal world, but it also gave it a chance to grow. As the world continued to absorb the essences of other worlds, it quickly perfected itself. In just a short span of 1,000 years, the world had already grown into a perfect and flawless world. Hell, perfection and flawlessness naturally meant that the world had grown to a point where it was almost perfect. There were no more flaws, and there was no more crudeness to be found. As for hell, it had already become the headquarters of the tribulation energy after it had gathered more than half of the tribulation energy in the eternal world. It had become the most dangerous place in the entire eternal world, the place where the battles were the most intense, and the level of the battle was also the highest. What was fighting in this place were not ordinary armies or cultivators, like in other worlds. Instead, there were sovereigns who were the embodiments of their will. Compared to the past, now, every day, every moment, there would be other hegemons who would send their incarnations, clones, or even their true bodies into this world to participate in the incomparably bitter battles that were taking place in this world. It could be said that if it wasn't for the fact that this world had gathered the essence of an unknown number of trillions of worlds within the eternal world, making it relatively perfect and flawless, just the level of the battle alone would have been enough to shatter this world countless times. At this point, the transportation network within the eternal world was no longer just a transportation network for living beings to move around. Instead, it had become a network for the movement of all energy, all origins, all essences, and even all concepts in this world. They had become crucial existences that the eternal world couldn't do without. Over the past 1,000 years, the battles in the eternal world had become unimaginably complicated. It was impossible to say how many hegemonic clones had been destroyed during the battle, but how many hegemonic clones had benefited greatly from the battle. Their strength had risen dramatically, and their cultivation had risen dramatically. Among them, Jianbin was not considered outstanding among the juggernauts, but in a short span of 1,000 years, it was as if he had jumped 3 levels to the top of the juggernauts, becoming the leader of one of the 17 mega-alliances that had unwittingly developed in the heart of the world. He commanded tens of millions of juggernauts, leading them in constant battles against the other 16 mega-alliances. Currently, he was only a tiny obstacle away from ascending. Even if he sensed an opportunity to break through this obstacle and successfully ascend, no one would be surprised. In other words, his will embodiment was almost perfect and flawless. If that was all, he wouldn't have been able to suppress all the rulers and become one of the 17 strongest. After all, even though there weren't that many rulers with nearly perfect will embodiments, there were still thousands of them. The reason why he was able to rise above the crowd and become one of the 17 strongest was because he had more than one will embodiment. He had a total of 365 will embodiments. Among them, the foundation of every concept incarnation was a concept that was completely different from the concept incarnation that they ruled over. These 365 will embodiments communicated with each other and fused together, increasing his strength by 1,000-fold. No, even 10,000-fold. If he was willing to abandon some of his will embodiments, he could even use them to erupt with power that was millions of times greater than normal. It was because of these methods that he was able to rise above the crowd and achieve his current status. The other rulers had no choice but to submit to him. On this day, Jianbin sat on his throne and looked down at the perfect heart world. He seemed a little dazed. It looks like the tribulations are about to reach the final step, he murmured to himself, a strange reverence in his eyes. It was a reverence that no other ruler would ever see in his eyes. Chapter 2076. 365 powers are still far from enough to form a complete world, but it's barely enough to form a seed or an embryonic form. That way, I'll be able to barely guarantee my safety in the upcoming tribulations. Jianbin thought to himself. The 365 consciousness clones appeared around him at the same time. That's right, at this moment, even his real body had entered the heart world before him. The 365 consciousness clones did not come from anything else. They came from his real body's comprehension of the world in front of him. They came from him risking everything, even if he had to leave a deep mark on the world in the process. He had paid a price that could be said to be connected to the heart world to a certain extent in order to obtain these results from the world. Back then, when he vaguely sensed the thoughts of the ruler of the abnormal landscape, he made a prompt decision to raise the status of the heart world to a level that even surpassed the world that he had paid a huge price to become the ruler of. He directly moved his real body into this world. After arriving here, he sensed that this world's acceptance of him was beyond his imagination. Although it still couldn't compare to the world that he had become the ruler of, it already had some of the charm of that world. Although he couldn't completely control the heart of the world, he could already fuse with a certain layer of the world, becoming an existence similar to the ruler of a certain layer. Because of this fusion, this allowed him to more keenly sense the mysterious power contained in this world, which was to say, the heavens and earth. The concept of fusing with the world. Back then, he was not even a ruler, but he could forcefully fuse the concept of a certain world into himself, making himself the ruler of that world. Now that he had become a ruler, his understanding of the concept of fusing with the world had reached an unimaginable depth. Naturally, he could do more things than before. Therefore, as he sensed more and more concepts, he grasped more and more of that mysterious power. In other words, to a certain extent, he grasped more and more concepts. In order to prevent these newly grasped concepts from interfering with the pure concept clones that he had already formed, he turned those newly grasped concepts into new concept clones. Just like that, after more than 1,000 years, he had formed 365 incarnations, representing all that he had grasped. 365 concepts. In the heart of the world, such a concept was not worth mentioning. However, compared to the other cultivators and the other sovereigns, it was a completely different concept. But this was already an incredible achievement. Among the 17 leaders of the super alliances, he relied on his 365 concept incarnations. Although he wasn't at the peak, he was still one of the top existences among the 17 leaders. In terms of strength, no one could ignore him. These 365 consciousness incarnations were currently surrounding Jianbin's true body, and each incarnation's position was extremely subtle. Vaguely, they formed an incomparably mysterious formation. The moment the formation took shape, each of the concept embodiments trembled and collapsed, turning into streams of concept embodiments that flowed along the formation towards the other concept embodiments. In just a few breaths, all the concept embodiments had formed an incomparably perfect cycle, activating the entire mysterious formation. After the formation was activated, a broken concept of heaven and earth appeared around him and wrapped around his body. This concept of heaven and earth was many times more perfect than the concept of heaven and earth that he'd set up by relying on the formation that his master had taught him. Although it was still broken and simple, it already possessed the aura that a true concept of heaven and earth should possess. It surrounded his surroundings, causing him to feel as if he'd already transcended everything in the world, and no tribulation, power, or disaster could pose a threat to him. More importantly, this concept world was no longer like the formation that his master had passed down, which could only be set up but not controlled. Right now, this concept world was like his body. He could understand even the slightest changes in it, and he could even manipulate and control it as he pleased. It was even to the extent that he had a miraculous feeling of being able to completely abandon his own body and directly make this concept world his own body. With a slight thought, the perception world before him began to rapidly shrink. In the blink of an eye, it had already turned into the size of his body. Furthermore, it began to change shape, turning into an appearance that was no different from his body. Gradually, it overlapped with his body, truly fusing with his body, becoming one with his body. At this moment, an indescribable aura of perfection and transcendence emanated from his body, faintly producing an inexplicable repulsion with the surrounding heart world. From above the sky, an indescribable attraction force appeared out of thin air, acting on his body and trying to pull him somewhere. That is, the third level. At this time, an inexplicable joy emerged in Jian Ben's heart, and his eyes became incomparably bright. This attraction force came from the third level of the road to Tao Master. This meant that he had now obtained a qualification to ascend to the third level of the road to Tao Master, and could step into the third level at any time. Realizing this, he could not help but be surprised and delighted. Now that he thought about it, it had been less than 1 billion years since he stepped into the second level of the road to Tao Master. This amount of time was not even enough for him to cultivate in seclusion once. Yet now, in just such a short amount of time, he'd already surpassed a breakthrough that other cultivators hadn't been able to achieve even after countless trillions of years, and he'd stepped into a higher realm. How pleasantly surprised and excited was this to him? It was self-evident. After thinking about it, he raised his hand and waved his hand. The repulsion force of the surrounding heaven and earth disappeared, and the attraction force from above the sky also disappeared. It was he who directly refused this opportunity to ascend. The reason for this was very simple. He wanted to see how the tribulation of this heaven and earth would develop. He wanted to understand. The plan of the ruler of this scene was completely different from what he had imagined from the very beginning. The pressure that the ruler of the scene brought to him was unimaginably strong. It was like a mountain firmly pressing down on his heart. The huge shadow that covered his body made him feel that no matter what he did, it seemed that it was all within the ruler's plan. It was impossible for him to escape from the ruler's control. Under such circumstances, as the successor of a Tao Master, how could he feel good? If he were to ascend at this time, it would indeed be the most beneficial for his cultivation. It would indeed allow him to reach the realm that he dreamed of reaching faster. However, this shadow, this kind of reverence, would forever remain in the bottom of his heart. This would inevitably affect his cultivation. On the contrary, if he stayed here to watch the development of the tribulation and understand what the ruler of the scene wanted to do, even if the final result was greater than he had imagined, even if the power displayed was more terrifying than he had imagined, because the result was already out, he had lost the basis to scare himself. The shadow, reverence, and shock that were produced because of this would ultimately continue to weaken with the passage of time, and one day it would completely disappear so that his cultivation would no longer be affected. It was because of this consideration that he had chosen this seemingly irrational method at this time, staying in this heaven and earth that was full of tribulations. However, from a certain perspective, this was actually not dangerous. After all, he now had the ability to draw upon the power of ascension at any time. As long as he encountered danger that he could not resist, he would naturally be able to draw upon the attraction of the third layer and directly pull him out of danger. He would be pulled from the second layer of the path to becoming a Dao master and into the third layer. With such an escape route, his choice did not seem to be a big deal anymore, so the ruler around here has always been there. After obtaining the right to ascend, the copy finally sensed the existence of a special region in the center of the eternal world for the first time. His senses told him that was like a black hole that devoured all perception and vision. No living being, no cultivator could see what was inside. Coupled with the situation of this scene, he naturally came to an understanding. There was definitely the overlord of this scene, the supreme existence that controlled the entire heavens and the earth, the descent of the tribulations, and the development of the tribulations. In fact, at this time, if he had the guts, he could even directly enter that area and directly meet Luo Fan, just like some of the sovereigns had done before they ascended. However, it was a pity that the fear that Luo Fan had cast on him made him feel awe, and he did not have the courage to do so at all. In fact, at this moment, he did not dare to extend his perception too much towards that area. He did not dare to think of a way to break through the isolation and shielding that the central area had on his perception. Instead, he quickly withdrew his perception. This response was completely instinctive, and he did not even think about it. By the time he reacted, his perception had already been completely withdrawn. When he was done, he was slightly taken aback and smiled bitterly. I didn't expect my fear of him to be so great. At this moment, he was even more certain that he had made the right decision to stay here and not ascend. If he really ascended to the third layer with this mentality and left this opportunity to see through the ruler's plan and erase the shadow in his heart, he did not know how serious the consequences of the shadow and fear would be in the future. At this moment, voices of congratulations and questions came from all directions. These were from the rulers who had sensed the change in his aura. The congratulations were directed at his great improvement in cultivation and the fact that he could ascend at any time. And those questions were directed at his choice not to ascend at this time. Jian Bin naturally could not tell them the true reason why he had stayed. He only said that he was reluctant to give up on the opportunity here. Although the sovereigns expressed their admiration for him on the surface, they inwardly cursed him for his greed. After all, although many of the sovereigns had attached themselves to the Jian Bin and formed an alliance with him, at the end of the day, they were still competitors with the Jian Bin. Since Jian Bin was left here, it naturally meant that their chances of obtaining the heart in the future would be reduced. How could they be happy about this? Regarding this, however, Jian Bin didn't care about it and casually brushed it off. After casually brushing them off, he began to go into seclusion to sense his improvements. He wanted to quickly grasp the power he had gained after his breakthrough. After all, this was a tribulation that affected the entire landscape. If he was not careful, he could die a violent death. If he did not work hard to grasp all the power he had, he would be irresponsible for his own life. Thus, Jian Bin cultivated in seclusion. Jian Bin was cultivating in seclusion here. The other sovereigns, on the other hand, were all beginning to make breakthroughs that they originally had little confidence in under the immense pressure he was exerting. Now that Jian Bin had broken through, if they didn't, wouldn't they always be inferior to him? Now that Jian Bin had broken through, if they didn't, wouldn't they always be inferior to him? If they wanted to obtain the opportunity of this world, wouldn't that be like a flower in a mirror or the moon in the water? If they didn't have much confidence in breaking through, their chances of success would naturally be low. Over the next few decades, a few rulers succeeded. Although none of them could ascend at any time like Jian Bin, at least their strength was comparable to Jian Bin's. Compared to Jian Bin, they weren't much weaker. If they joined forces, they would be able to stand on equal footing. However, even more rulers failed to break through. Although their lives weren't in danger, their strength was greatly reduced. Their chances of obtaining the final opportunity in the future had decreased by an unfathomable amount. In fact, they could almost be said to have been completely eliminated. These changes directly changed the situation in the heart of the world, causing many forces to undergo a great reshuffle. 9 of the 17 alliances were overturned, and they were scattered into thousands of alliances. They were then reunited, eventually forming 7 alliances that were completely different from before. In other words, after a decade or so, the Heart Realm was now dominated by 15 alliances. In fact, it could even be said that they were in charge of the development of the world's tribulations. Among them, the alliance that Jianben belonged to didn't budge. Instead, many rulers joined the alliance, making it much stronger. It was practically a leviathan in the Heart Realm. The tribulations in the billions and trillions of worlds in the Eternal Realm were developing like wildfire. However, the Heart Realm, which was the core of the tribulations, fell into an eerie calm. The calm was like the calm before the storm. It gave rise to an indescribable pressure that made all of the sovereigns and cultivators incredibly nervous. It was as if they were holding on to barrels of gunpowder, ready to explode at the slightest touch. This calm lasted for 1,000 years. Finally, at a certain moment, the entire Eternal Realm began to shake violently. Waves of strange and mysterious light began to appear in the billions and trillions of worlds in the Eternal Realm. Inside this light, all the rulers felt the will that had fused with them tremble violently. They felt a powerful impact that came from nowhere and affected their will. As rulers, they felt an indescribable challenge. What's going on? All the rulers began to panic. After all, the status of a ruler was extremely important to them. Not only did it give them enough strength and authority, but it also gave them the chance to ascend to the 3rd layer and take one step closer to the eternal and invincible Tao sovereigns. Under such circumstances, how could they not care about their status as rulers? How could he not panic when his identity as a ruler was being challenged? These natives are becoming rulers. In contrast to the other rulers' nervousness and panic, Jianben came to a sudden realization. His eyes flickered with shock, but he also felt like he had expected this to happen. It was more complicated than he had imagined. At this moment, the world he was in was also changing. Hundreds of cultivators who were born and raised in that world were blessed by the world and obtained a portion of the authority to rule over that world. When these authorities were gathered together, they could naturally become rulers of that part of the world. They would have the status of a ruler and obtain the power of a ruler. In fact, they might even be able to transcend the world and truly step onto the path of a Tao sovereign, becoming cultivators who could continuously advance on the path of a Tao sovereign like them. After being split into hundreds of portions, every cultivator who obtained this authority would obtain many abilities that surpassed other living beings. They would be able to increase their strength countless times over. After obtaining this authority, these living beings were all pleasantly surprised, panicked, and greedy. However, they could all sense the existence of the other cultivators who had obtained this authority. They knew that their goal was to defeat them, seize their authority, and finally take it all for themselves. They would become rulers of the world and obtain a chance to transcend. At the same time, they also knew that they would become the targets of the other cultivators who had obtained this authority. It was also because they knew this that they had been so excited and panicked earlier. Chapter 2077. Following this change, the tribulations in the eternal world sped up like a geyser. In the blink of an eye, the world entered a new era. Even the world that had gradually calmed down was once again plunged into a boundless and horrifying war. Slaughter covered the heavens and the earth. Every part of the world was covered in the color of blood. Every part of the world collapsed, perished, and was reborn in this process. For the native beings, obtaining authority was a chance to transcend. Phoenix, 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 update fast. Obtaining more authority meant that the authority to transcend became greater. As a result, those who obtained authority would naturally try their best to gather the other authorities. This would naturally lead to war and drag the world into the abyss of tribulations. Time flew by. The eternal world seemed to have turned into an Azura hell. There were wars everywhere, massacres everywhere, sorrow everywhere, pain everywhere, and hatred everywhere. The authority of the various worlds started to gather, gather, and disperse again and again. Only after a full 10 years did the first world have a native life form become the ruler of that world. He truly stood on the same level as the other rulers in the world. After becoming the ruler of the world, the cultivator naturally surpassed all the other cultivators in the world. He was so powerful that he could suppress everything in the world. Thus, naturally, all the internal struggles over this authority within the world naturally calmed down. As a result, the world's tribulations were past. As the world's tribulations passed, the world emitted a dazzling light of transcendence that illuminated the entire eternal world. It lit up the night sky and added a bit of life and hope to the originally dark night sky. This change was like the first domino that toppled over. It started to cause more and more changes. More and more of the world's authorities started to gather. More and more native cultivators started to obtain the status of rulers. This also made the night sky brighter and brighter. In the short span of 100,000 years, the night sky of the eternal world had returned to its starry state before the tribulation. All the worlds had regained their former vitality. On this day, the authority of the final world had finally been gathered. The moment when a ruler appeared in all the worlds. At this moment, the entire eternal world trembled slightly. The appearance of Luo Fan, who originally looked like he was sitting cross-legged, underwent a huge change. Luo Fan, who was sitting cross-legged, gradually stood up. There was a faint feeling of ascension coming from him. It was as if the entire eternal heaven and earth was about to ascend. However, it was obvious that this was a strange scene. It was closely related to the second level of the Tao Master's path. It could even be said to be an inseparable scene, even though it had the feeling of ascension. However, it was still impossible for him to ascend to the heavens. At the very least, this kind of charm had to be enhanced by 1,000,000,000,000 times in order to have a 1 or 2% chance of ascending. Everything within the eternal world had escaped the tribulation, which also meant that the entire world had finally escaped the tragic tribulation that had suddenly descended upon them. At this time, the billions of consciousness incarnations in the heart world sensed the changes of the world in a daze. That's it. Some consciousness incarnations murmured. The passing of the tribulations was both a good and a bad thing for them. The good thing was that there was no more tribulations. They naturally would not be in any danger and would not have to worry about their lives being threatened. However, without the tribulations, the activity of the worlds and the strange scene had stopped. It was no longer possible for them to obtain the good cultivation environment in the tribulations. However, this was only secondary. The most important thing was where was the opportunity represented by the heart world. They had left the other worlds to come here because they sensed the existence of such an opportunity. In the process, even their control over the world they ruled had weakened greatly, almost causing the world to fluctuate. The natives had almost overthrown their position and seized the position of ruler. Now, the tribulations had passed, but their opportunity was still nowhere to be found. How could they accept this? How could they not be bewildered? Compared to the other rulers who were bewildered, Jin Bin's expression was extremely calm. He stared closely at a certain place in the heart world. Based on his understanding and guesses of the changes in the world over the past few days, and based on his understanding and guesses of the ruler who had caused all of this, he knew that there was no way that the ruler would lie to them about this. If there was an opportunity, then there must be one here that would surprise them. If it hadn't appeared yet, then it definitely meant that the following developments hadn't come to an end yet. Just as he was looking at the heart of the world suddenly started to expand and contract. Immediately afterwards, waves of wondrous existences from the billions of worlds in the eternal world started to rapidly flow towards the heart world through the transportation network. As these existences poured into the heart world, every ruler in the heart world felt that the entire world was undergoing some sort of crucial transformation. This transformation was extremely profound and wondrous. It couldn't even be described with words. All they knew was that during this transformation, they could sense that the world around them was becoming more and more profound, more and more complete. They could vaguely sense an all-encompassing quality emanating from every corner of the world. When they saw this transformation, all the rulers understood that their previous guesses had been completely wrong. Immediately, all the rulers began to release all of their senses and power, trying their best to fuse with the heart world. They were going to transform along with the world. Among them, Jian Ben, who had mastered 365 concepts, was the most efficient existence among them. In a flash, he had completely merged with the world. Even his true body had disappeared without a trace. He had completely merged with the world. At this moment, he could feel a certain warm aura wrapping around him, allowing him to clearly feel that his body and mind were improving with every passing moment, every passing moment. Every moment was approaching a higher peak and leaping towards a higher level. From the outside, it looked like the entire eternal world had been activated. From the billions of worlds in the world, all sorts of concepts were constantly being injected into the heart through a network of communication that resembled blood vessels and meridians, constantly nurturing the heart world. This allowed the heart world to continuously grow and strengthen until it finally became the operating core of the entire world's concepts. It began to move all of the concepts in the world, causing the fused concepts of the various worlds to be tempered again and again during this process. At the same time, all the cultivators who had become rulers of the various worlds, whether they were native cultivators or cultivators who had entered from the second level of the Tao Sovereign Path, felt an indescribable power helping them reach a higher peak. Their understanding of their own fusion of concepts was also growing stronger with every passing moment. The native cultivators were much weaker than the cultivators who had entered from the second level of the Tao Sovereign Path. Even the strongest among them could barely enter the first level of the Tao Master's Path. Under such circumstances, after the native cultivators became rulers of the world, their understanding and application of the concepts were naturally far inferior to the cultivators who had entered from the second level of the Tao Sovereign Path. In other words, if they cultivated like the cultivators who had entered from the second level of the Tao Sovereign Path, it would probably take these native rulers hundreds of trillions of years to condense their perfect concept incarnations and obtain true transcendence. They would then be able to leave the eternal world and step into the first level of the Tao Sovereign Path, but at this time, the situation was completely different. As the concepts they had fused with began to circulate within the heart world, they collided with other concepts, stimulated each other, and complemented each other. He was constantly activating the concept that he had fused with, allowing him to continuously grasp the mysteries of fusing with the concept in the process, allowing his cultivation realm to improve faster and faster, constantly advancing in the direction of being able to condense a complete concept incarnation. During this process, those who already had a perfect concept incarnation obtained even more benefits. They could comprehend more of the mysteries of other concepts during this process and obtain more secrets of using other concepts. The possibility of obtaining the incarnations of other concepts had increased by countless times. The entire world was no longer dissatisfied. It's finally done. At this moment, in the center of the eternal world, Luo Fan, who had been silent for countless years, opened his eyes and murmured. His eyes shone through the countless trillions of worlds within the eternal world, and he completely saw the circulation of concepts within the entire world. The incomparably perfect circulation, the never-ending improvement, made him feel that his efforts over the past hundreds of millions of years had not been in vain. At this moment, he could feel that his worldview of laws was constantly being perfected, and his ability to use the worldview of laws was constantly improving. If this state continued, in less than 100 billion years, he would definitely be able to make the most perfect use of the worldview of laws that he had grasped. In the end, his strength would skyrocket countless times. The reason why he had spent so much time and energy to trigger this tribulation and turn the eternal world into its current state was because of this. After obtaining the 129,600 cores, this world could only continue to maintain its original stable state after he left. It could only passively wait for other cultivators on the second level of the Down Master's path to enter and become rulers. If that was the case, with the billions of worlds in this eternal world, it would probably have to wait until the end of time, or even until the entire path to becoming a Down Master was destroyed. Perhaps only then would there be enough cultivators to make up for the ruler of all the worlds. In this case, this method of cultivating with the help of the eternal world was nothing more than a flower in a mirror, a moon in the water. If there was really no other way, and he really couldn't think of a way to change it, Luo Fan could only wait like this, waiting for the perfection that might only appear after countless trillions of years. However, it was clear that he had finally found a way to solve this problem. It was impossible for the cultivators on the second level of the Down Master's path to have as many trillions of worlds as there were in the eternal world. Even if there were that many, it was unlikely that every cultivator could find a world that suited them, and it was even more unlikely that every cultivator could use this world to form an idea incarnation or even cultivate it to perfection. Therefore, he wanted to find enough cultivators on the Down Master's path to make the eternal world complete. It could be said that it was impossible. However, just because it couldn't be done on the Down Master's path didn't mean it couldn't be done elsewhere. Out of the countless trillions of worlds, every single one of them was filled with countless living beings, even those worlds that had no cultivators. Even worlds without cultivators would only need a little guidance to produce enough cultivators. In other words, as long as he changed his target to the native cultivators born in these worlds, it would no longer be a problem to make up for the number of rulers of all the worlds. However, under normal circumstances, it would be impossible for Luo Fan to force some living beings to become rulers by himself. Not only did he have strict requirements for the world, but he also had extremely strict requirements for the cultivators who became rulers. If it was only millions, tens of millions, or even hundreds of millions, or even billions of worlds, it would only be a bit of trouble for him. At most, he would just have to pay a small price to solve it. However, if this number increased to trillions, and it was unknown how many trillions there were, even if his mystique was 10,000 times more powerful, he wouldn't be able to do it. Therefore, in order to achieve this goal, he thought of using the power of the entire second level of the Down Master's path. Everything that happened after that, it was just as Jian Ben had guessed. He took advantage of the situation and guided the 16 cultivators to deal with a certain world's consciousness. Then, he used the backlash of the consciousness to suppress them, triggering a minor tribulation of the world. Then, he used the connection between the world and karma. This minor tribulation was magnified layer by layer, until it became an intermediate tribulation that affected a portion of the eternal world. After that, he used the power of the rulers to maintain the intermediate tribulation, causing the effects of the intermediate tribulation to grow stronger and stronger. Finally, he gave it a push. Using the transcendence that the rulers possessed as cultivators on the second level of the Down Master's path had, he connected the intermediate tribulation with the power of the entire second level of the Down Master's path. He directly triggered the overall power of the second level of the Down Master's path, causing the power of the tribulation to flow from the second level of the Down Master's path into the eternal world. This pushed the intermediate tribulation that affected a portion of the eternal world to a level that the entire eternal world couldn't transcend. As mentioned before, the Down Master's path was built for cultivators to become Down Masters, in other words, to become true saints. Therefore, there was a chance of survival for any existence. Even the living beings born within the eternal world were no exception. Therefore, the tribulation triggered by Luo Fan's layers upon layers of calculations was just as he had planned. Among the many worlds, there was a chance for the living beings to transcend, so that the living beings would not have to wait hopelessly for the arrival of destruction. Instead, there was finally a chance for them to transcend the world, transcend the eternal world, and truly embark on the road of Down Master as a true adventurer. If it weren't for Luo Fan controlling everything behind the scenes, this chance of survival could exist in any way. Even the chance of survival in each world would inevitably be different. In the end, it would become strange and chaotic, Just like the many worlds in the first level of the Tao Master's Path, where the nomological laws were at the same level as the Great World. But obviously, such a thing couldn't happen. After all, Luo Fan was controlling everything behind the scenes. And he was, after all, the creator of the eternal world, the supreme ruler of the entire strange phenomenon. He couldn't create this chance of survival out of thin air, but he could choose the manifestation of his chance of survival through various means. The final result was like this. He took advantage of the second level of the Tao Master's Path to give all the cultivators a chance of survival and directly materialize the identity of the ruler in the form of authority. He became an immortal existence that could only circulate in the world, and the hope for all the indigenous cultivators to transcend. It also became the way for him to complete the eternal world and all the ideas that he had integrated into it. The final development of things went extremely smoothly according to his plan. Occasionally there were twists and turns, but they all developed in a good direction. After all, those who could just barely see the existence of his goal would naturally know how to choose to cooperate with him. Those who couldn't see his goal would naturally be at his mercy, unable to affect him at all. Everything has been settled. It seems that it's time to leave. Luo Fan slowly stood up, an inexplicable joy in his eyes, and said so. Chapter 2078. Over the years, although Luo Fan had been planning to make the eternal world as complete as possible and as long as possible after he left, during this process, because every bit of improvement in the eternal world was reflected in his worldview, his cultivation realm had also made great progress. At least, at this time, he could sense that his fifth trial had become much clearer. Faintly, he even had a feeling that he was almost able to grasp the time when the fifth trial would come. In fact, it was precisely because of this that he was unwilling to continue wasting time in the second layer of the Tao Master's Path. Instead, he tried his best to leave the second layer and step into the third layer. After all, the higher the level of the Tao Master's Path, the better the cultivation environment would be. The more enlightenment he could obtain from it, the faster his cultivation realm would improve. In this way, if he continued to stay in the second layer of the Tao Master's Path, if he did not make enough progress before the tribulation of heaven and earth arrived, wouldn't his success rate be greatly affected? The moment Luo Fan disappeared from the eternal world, the entire eternal world shook slightly. The eternal world, which looked like Luo Fan's ascending figure, also became sluggish. In a trance, it seemed as if some kind of power had suddenly pressed down on it from above, causing it to sink. With this change, the figure of Luo Fan began to change slightly. From its original ascending figure, it returned to sitting cross-legged, firmly fixed in the void. It looked as if it had integrated into the entire void and become the void that suppressed it, an existence that was suppressed by the void. With the change of its posture, the eternal seal in its hands suddenly stopped and became fixed in the starting gesture of the eternal seal. It did not look like a living creature, but more like a statue. Then, the layer of light that had originally enveloped the eternal world and isolated it from the outside gradually began to converge. Not long after, it had completely converged into the eternal world, revealing the appearance of the eternal world without any concealment. For the first time, the disciples of the Tao Masters who had never stepped into the eternal heaven and earth saw the true appearance of the eternal heaven and earth. He actually refined this phenomenon into his own body. At this moment, the face of the second senior brother appeared on his phenomenon and looked at the eternal world from afar. His expression was one of astonishment and helplessness. Changing the appearance of the abnormal landscape was not a problem for any cultivator who had become the ruler of the abnormal landscape. Especially for the disciples of Tao Masters like them, it was just a matter of thought. However, it was beyond the imagination of the disciples of the Tao Masters to transform this unusual landscape into such a form that was exactly the same as their own figures. How narcissistic must one be to do such a thing at this moment? Second senior brother's eyes flickered as he saw the starting gesture of the indestructible seal that the indestructible world was making with his hands. For a moment, countless thoughts lit up in his mind. Endless mysterious information flowed into his mind, making him vaguely feel as if he had seen the indestructible world forming billions of seals. These seals were unfathomably mysterious and complex, revealing an incomparably strong sense of indestructibility, which made people feel as if it was a divine skill of the Tao Master level. What a mysterious divine ability transformation. This person actually directly made such a divine ability public. This boldness is something I can't compare to. After a while, the second senior brother sighed. He said in a somewhat frustrated manner, obviously, he had deduced the entire indestructible seal that Luo Fan had integrated into the eternal world from the starting gesture of the indestructible seal. He had completely mastered the entire indestructible seal. The indestructible seal looked ordinary and seemed to be just a divine skill. In fact, the changes inside were subtle and indescribable. It contained a supreme mystery of the concept of indestructibility. If a cultivator could fully master the indestructible seal and fully comprehend its deep meaning, he might be able to comprehend the concept of indestructibility. Although the concept of immortality was just a concept extracted from Luo Fan's worldview, it seemed that there was no difference in quality between it and other concepts, and there was no difference in strength between them. However, this was only on the surface. In fact, because the essence of a Tao Master or a true sage was eternal and indestructible, the concept of immortality was the closest to the essence of a Tao Master. Or in other words, the concept of immortality was the closest to the essence of a Tao Master. Such a concept was naturally crude for existences like a Tao Master. Even absorbing it would pollute one's body. However, for existences who had not become true sages, this was the best way for them to understand existences at the Tao Master level. As long as they could integrate this concept of indestructibility, they would be able to approach the essence of a Tao Master or a true sage to some extent. This couldn't really make them indestructible, but it was enough to open a small window, a window to peep into Tao Masters or true sages. For a cultivator, such a window was even a way for them to peep into the direction of their own future. For a cultivator, the importance of this was self-evident at this time. Even the second senior brother had to try his best to comprehend the indestructible seal in order to comprehend more things from it, and to peep into more of the essence and mystery reflected from a Tao Master. Even if it was just a trace or a wisp, it was enough for him to scramble like a flock of ducks. Following the second senior brother's actions, the disciples of the other Tao Masters also reacted. One by one, shadows and faces appeared on the strange scenes and began to look at the eternal heaven and earth, observing the mysteries that even the second senior brother had to pay attention to. After all, they were all disciples of Tao Masters. Soon, they saw the indestructible seal, which could almost be regarded as a way to comprehend the concept of indestructibility. For a time, the expressions of every disciple of Tao Masters changed. They were all shocked, incredulous, and even more indescribably pleasantly surprised. This kind of change naturally triggered the existence of the void in this area. That was the attention of the other cultivators. More and more gazes began to come out of the various strange scenes and gradually focused on the indestructible world and the starting gesture of the indestructible seal, and so on and so forth. Countless strange scenes in the entire void fell into an inexplicable atmosphere of cultivation, both inside and outside. This atmosphere of cultivation was mostly caused by the indestructible world that Luo Fan had left behind after hundreds of years. The second senior brother finally let out a long roar. Ideas surged all over his body, and a wisp of his indestructible concept began to be born. This wisp of indestructible concept was extremely weak, even less than a millionth of the concept of indestructibility that Luo Fan had left on the second level of the indestructible world. However, this wisp of indestructible concept was enough to make the second senior brother extremely surprised. At this moment, he seemed to have grasped the last chance of survival. and his whole body was surrounded by an indescribable joy and excitement. The face of his concept disappeared along with it. The strange scene where it was located began to emit some kind of indescribable light. Within this light, a kind of transcendent charm was emitted from its body. Sure enough, through it, I can finally peek into a higher level. A leisurely sigh echoed inside the strange scene, causing the creatures cultivating in the scene to be shocked. Just at this moment, a figure gradually separated itself from the strange scene. This figure was none other than the second senior brother's figure. However, compared to before, he was no longer an incarnation of the concept, but a real body of flesh and blood. In other words, his real body. In the process of leaving the strange scene, the real body was under unimaginable pressure, as if some kind of indescribable resistance had appeared on his body. It was as if some kind of indescribable resistance had appeared on his body to prevent him from leaving the strange scene. In the face of such resistance, he was not the slightest bit discouraged. Instead, he used all his means. All kinds of concepts kept surging, constantly attacking the strange scene below and constantly separating himself from it. In a seemingly struggling posture, he climbed out of the strange scene bit by bit. His choice caused many of the Tao Master's disciples to be bewildered. For a time, the incarnations of concepts emerged from the various strange scenes. They quickly cast their eyes on the strange scene that the second senior brother had mastered. In the blink of an eye, they had already surrounded this place tightly. Second senior brother, why are you doing this? Why do you want to leave this strange scene? Isn't it good to cultivate here? A Tao Master's disciple finally could not help but ask loudly. This question, it was also the common doubt of many of the Tao Master's disciples. After all, in the second level, it was really perfect to use these strange scenes as a medium to cultivate. It could be said that here, even if they were to lie down, they could feel their own improvement at all times. If this continued, as long as the conditions were right, they would inevitably be able to step into a higher level and take a step forward to become a Tao Master. Under such circumstances, with such convenience, the second senior brother, who should have controlled the entire second level of the Tao Master's path, was struggling so painfully to leave. This was really incomprehensible to them. Yes, second senior brother, we are the Tao Master's disciples. As long as we cultivate according to the right method, we will eventually be able to break through. Why do we have to leave this level before we reach perfection like the other individual cultivators? Another Tao Master's disciple said, it was not difficult for the Tao Master's disciples to ascend to the third level. At least, for the Tao Master's disciples who could become the master of a strange scene here, it was simply a matter of whether they wanted to or not. After all, according to the rules of the Tao Master's path, as long as they passed through a strange scene, they could ascend. Obviously, to become the master of a strange scene, passing through the strange scene was only a prerequisite. The reason why they did not ascend, but chose to continue cultivating here and become the master of these strange scenes was very simple. It was because they thought that ascending in this way was not perfect. What the Tao Master's disciples pursued was obviously different from that of ordinary individual cultivators. For individual cultivators, their greatest pursuit was to improve as quickly and as greatly as possible. For this pursuit, ascending to the third level as quickly as possible was obviously the best choice. In contrast, it was different for the Tao Master's disciples. They pursued an incomparably stable and solid foundation. For them, to improve each realm to a level that could not be improved anymore, and to reach the end of each realm. This was what they pursued. For them, each level of the Tao Master's path was a realm for them. In other words, in their hearts, obtaining all the benefits that could be obtained from each level and all the improvements that could be brought to them could be considered as a true perfection and a solid foundation. Only then could they continue to improve. At this time, the second senior brother was wholeheartedly struggling to get out of the strange scene and had no time to pay attention to the Tao Master's disciples. At this time, he was just struggling with difficulty. Seeing this, the Tao Master's disciples naturally did not pester him endlessly, and no one tried to stop him. After all, they were all Tao Master's disciples. Even if their choices were different, they could only respect them and could not impose their own thoughts on others. Even if they were puzzled by the second senior brother's choice and found it difficult to understand, they would only ask for clarification. And it was impossible for them to intervene without the second senior brother's consent. After all, the second senior brother was the strongest among all the Tao Masters on the second level. Even though he was too deeply integrated with the strange scene and was tried his best to stay, it only took him a few days to finally break free from all restraints and escape. He floated in the void with his real body. Second senior brother, why did you do this? Seeing that he had finally escaped, the other Tao Master's disciples continued to ask. Seeing the many Tao Master's disciples' burning eyes, the second senior brother smiled slightly and said, I just suddenly realized that it is not the best choice for me to stay here. Senior brother, are you planning to ascend before your cultivation is completed? Another Tao Master's disciple exclaimed. Hearing this, the second senior brother said with a smile, If you think so, then so be it. My thoughts don't matter. Not only will I not be able to enlighten you, maybe it will disturb your thoughts. So I won't say it. Through the stimulation of the immortal concept, he had already thought it through. It was indeed a good choice to wait for the second level of cultivation to be completed before breaking through. He could use a huge amount of time in exchange for his natural ascension. However, this kind of cultivation method was somewhat incompatible with his nature. This kind of incompatibility made his cultivation efficiency several times worse than that of other Tao Master's disciples. If he waited like this, maybe when a Tao Master's disciple became a Tao Master, he might not be able to ascend to the third level naturally. I prefer adventure. Suppressing the desire to ascend will do me more harm than good. This was the second senior brother's inner thought, and it was also the reason why he made such a choice at this time. However, these things obviously belonged to him. If other cultivators and other Tao Master's disciples made the same choice as him, it was very likely that their cultivation path would be cut off. Obviously, he could not say this to the others who were also disciples of the Tao Master, unless he would rather have a large number of irreconcilable enemies in the future. Hearing the second senior brother's words, the other Tao Master's disciples looked at each other, a little confused and at a loss. The second senior brother had been cultivating at the second level of the Tao Master's path for billions of years, but now he had a new idea. Moreover, it was because of a new person who had appeared more than 1 billion years ago. No matter how one looked at it, it was ridiculous and unbelievable, right? Well, you can choose who will be the second senior brother next. We will see you later. The second senior brother bowed to the many Tao Master's disciples and said so. As he spoke, his body revealed a kind of transcendent aura. His whole body seemed to be pulled by an invisible force at a higher level, and his body began to gradually become illusory. After a while, he had completely disappeared from this area, as if he had never existed. With his disappearance, the original brightest and most dazzling landscape of the second senior brother and the whole area trembled slightly, and the light began to quickly dim. In just a dozen breaths, it had turned from the brightest and most dazzling star into an inconspicuous bright spot, directly giving up the highest position in the whole area. The many Tao Master's disciples were stunned, and then their expressions began to change. The position of the second senior brother seemed to be just a title, but represented the leader of countless Tao Master's disciples on the second level of the Tao Master's path. His power was hundreds of millions of times stronger than the ruler of heaven and earth, or the emperor of the mortal world. Even if these Tao Master's disciples had a perfect mind and a strong state of mind, they could not help but be tempted by this position. As their hearts changed, the other Tao Master's disciples who were originally companions became their competitors one by one. At this time, a Tao Master's disciple said lightly, "There needs to be a rule to choose the second senior brother. What do you think?" This person was not the strongest among the disciples of the Tao Masters, but he was relatively the oldest. According to the relationship between the disciples of the Tao Masters, he could almost be regarded as the senior brother of most of the disciples of the Tao Masters. Chapter 2079. The overall changes to the second level of the Tao Sovereign Path were no longer important to Luo Fan, nor were they important to the cultivators in the eternal world. Meanwhile, inside the eternal realm, the cultivators and rulers were all immersed in an incomparably mystical state. It wasn't just the indescribable epiphany brought about by the changes in the eternal world. More importantly, an indescribable sense of stability emerged from the bottom of their hearts. This sense of stability was something that had no sense of existence before. It didn't make any living beings feel uncomfortable. They were still doing what they were supposed to do. They were still cultivating and fighting. Nothing would be affected by the lack of this sense of stability. However, when this sense of stability appeared, they suddenly realized that they had been lacking this sense of stability before. It was like a short-sighted person taking off their glasses and wiping them clean. The landscape has completely stabilized. This thought flashed through the minds of many cultivators. They felt an indescribable sense of security when they thought of this, but they also felt an indescribable sense of regret. Now that the landscape was completely fixed, it meant that it would never disappear or be destroyed. If there were no accidents, it would continue to exist until the Tao Master's path was completely destroyed. This was the source of their sense of security. However, this stability also meant that this abnormal phenomenon would become incomparably stable from now on. Under such stability, any cultivator who wanted to become the ruler of a certain world and obtain the fortune and treasures of a certain world as easily as before would not be able to do so. The difficulty would increase by at least 100 times. This was the source of their regret. Such complex emotions caused the expressions of the cultivators who were thinking about this to fluctuate indeterminately. The heart realm. During this process, the strands gradually stabilized. Its size. Unknowingly, it had shrunk to the size of a normal world. Even though the light it was emitting was bright, it was no longer like another sun. It was just like the brightest star in the sky. The will avatars of the rulers in the heart world had already broken away from the comprehension they had gained from the transformation of the world. They were all looking around blankly, trying to sense what was happening. There was only Jianben. It was still fusing into the heart world. He was still using that indescribable posture to comprehend the endless concepts contained within, to sense the all-encompassing nature within. This was an extremely rare coincidence. It was precisely because he had fused with the world before this that he was able to comprehend the various profundities and concepts contained within the world. That was why he was able to maintain this state even after the world had stabilized. He wasn't like the other hegemons, who had lost their state of comprehension because of the changes. However, this was only a one-time use. Once he broke away from this comprehension, he would be able to free himself from that world. What awaited him was the same fate as the other hegemons. Similarly, it would be difficult for him to enter that world again, and it would be difficult for him to obtain such convenience. Jianben had already sensed this the moment the world changed, and it was this feeling that made him make up his mind to delay his ascension to the third level of the Tao Master as long as possible. The hegemon has already left. Perhaps I can try to become the hegemon of this landscape. Jianben's mind suddenly flickered. This sentence suddenly appeared in his mind. As this sentence appeared, his eyes suddenly flashed with the light of ambition. At this moment, all the teachings and inheritances he had received from his master had naturally appeared. They all emerged naturally and flowed through his mind bit by bit. His master was a disciple of a Tao Venerate, a supreme existence who had been personally taught by a Tao Venerate. In his opinion, the breadth of his knowledge was boundless. Every word and action of such an existence contained endless mysteries of cultivation. Although he hadn't directly learned how to become the hegemon of a landscape from his master's teachings, there were all kinds of hints, clues, and descriptions that existed now that he thought about it. The various scenes from back then already appeared in his mind. Unknowingly, he had already comprehended many things. He could vaguely see how to refine the eternal world and become the hegemon of the eternal world. I'll give it a try, he murmured in the end, his eyes shining with incomparable determination. The methods used by the supreme hegemon back then, the control he had displayed, and the divine abilities he had left an incomparably deep impression on him. It could be said that the supreme hegemon had almost become another milestone that surpassed even his masters. Under such circumstances, there was no way he would let go of the opportunity to become the same as the supreme hegemon. Even if it was extremely likely to be useless, even if it was extremely likely to delay his cultivation, he would not turn back. As he made up his mind, he began to work even harder to sense the concept contained within the heart world. He even used the heart world to sense the entire eternal world, searching for the mechanism he wanted to find. Jianbin's choice was out of Luo Fan's expectations. However, it didn't affect him at all. It wasn't just because he was the creator of the eternal heaven and earth. No matter who became the ruler, they couldn't sever his connection with the eternal heaven and earth. In other words, it was impossible to change the fact that he could obtain all sorts of inspirations and insights from the eternal heaven and earth at every moment. Moreover, even though he'd left the eternal world, his identity was still that of the overlord of the eternal world. Any existence, whether it was a disciple of a Tao master or a disciple of a Tao master, if one wanted to become a hegemon, they would definitely need his approval in the end. In other words, as long as he didn't agree. Even if Jianbin didn't make any mistakes, the method he chose to become a hegemon was still feasible. It was impossible for him to become the hegemon of the eternal world. Under such circumstances, he naturally didn't need to worry about the eternal world being taken by others. It was precisely because he understood this that he was able to leave the eternal world without any worries and step onto the third level of the Tao Master's path. At this moment, Luo Fan, who had left the second level of the Tao Master's path, had already arrived at a boundless void. This void was so vast and so barren. Even with Luo Fan's senses, he couldn't find anything in it at all. With a sweep, he didn't discover anything at all. Even space-time, laws, and even the void didn't exist at all. There is only an indescribable, endless void. This is the third level of the Tao Master's path. Looking at the void, Luo Fan couldn't help but feel a little surprised. He had considered what the third level would look like. He had even considered that it would be a chaotic scene. However, he had never thought that the third level would be completely void like this. He moved his body and sensed his own situation. He was sure that he wasn't being pulled into a state that was separated from his body. In other words, this was indeed the third level of the Tao Master's path. It's really unexpected. Luo Fan sighed, sat cross-legged, and began to spread out his perception, constantly sweeping the nothingness. In the process, he constantly dug into the depths of the nothingness, trying to find some special existence that might exist behind the nothingness. The third level of the Tao Master's path could not just be the void in front of him. Not to mention other things, it was impossible that the practitioners who had stepped onto the third level of the Tao Master's path did not exist. If those practitioners didn't exist, what were the practitioners he saw returning to the second level from the third level in the opposite direction? Where did those practitioners who had ascended to the third level go? Luo Fan didn't know how many times he had encountered the state of absolute nothingness. It could be said that he had plenty of experience dealing with such situations. He was very clear about it. Any state of absolute nothingness behind it. There must be something behind it. It was like in a certain world, the void under the rule of law. Behind it was the great way. And in the void that existed in the heavens and realms, behind it, there must be a state of chaos. In fact, according to the fundamental principle that all perfect worlds and great worlds were in a state of chaos. Even if the void in front of him was complete and barren, there must be a state of chaos behind it. Now, what Luo Fan needed to do was to see what was behind the void. He wanted to see if it was a state of chaos, and what else was there besides that. Only by seeing through this could he really grasp the void in front of him and grasp the truth of the third level of the Tao Master's path. Just like that, 100 years had passed. In the past 100 years, the entire void had not changed at all. Whether it was in reality or in Luo Fan's perception, it was the same. Compared to 100 years ago, his understanding of the void in front of him had not improved at all. How did he feel about the void when he first stepped here 100 years ago? And how did he feel about the void now? For an ordinary cultivator, there was no progress at all in 100 years. This was enough to annoy and make it difficult for them to control themselves. But for Luo Fan, who could treat 1,000,000,000,000 years as an instant, it was not enough to leave any trace in his heart. His attitude was still the same as before, without any signs of being affected. At least, this proves that behind the void, there is more than just a state of chaos. On this day, Luo Fan recalled the experience of 100 years. A faint smile suddenly appeared on his face, and he thought so in his heart. After 100 years of deep perception, his cultivation realm was many times more profound than when he was in the heavens and realms. If there was a state of chaos below, he should have found it long ago. But now he did not find it at all, and he could not sense the existence below at all. This proved that there must be more than just a state of chaos below the void. A more complex, more mysterious existence. This was the only way for such a situation to occur. I haven't seen any other cultivators in 100 years. It doesn't matter if they ascended or were originally on the 3rd level. This proves that this is a relatively independent area that belongs to me. He looked around and pondered, searching for the truth of the void in front of him. There was no progress at all in 100 years. Even if he sat here and sensed, it would be difficult to change this fact. At that moment, Luo Fan no longer hesitated and stood up. He stood up and began to walk forward, step by step. There was nothing in the absolute void that could be used as a reference. Even the aura he left behind could not remain in the void. As long as he left, it would naturally disappear, and he could not be used as a reference. So, to him, wherever he went, that was where he went. It seemed to be no different from before. If it wasn't for his firm heart and absolute control over his body, he might have doubted whether he existed after walking for a while. Just like that, he walked, while searching for abnormalities in his surroundings, looking for a starting point to break the deadlock. However, it was obvious that this was not a simple matter. Just like that, 100 years passed in a flash. His feeling towards the void was still the same as it was 200 years ago. Things that he didn't feel before, he still didn't feel now. The kind of void that he felt before, he still felt it now. How strange. On this day, Luo Fan stopped. He muttered. Although his perception of his surroundings didn't change at all, it was still the same as before. However, these didn't leave a trace on his body. His expression, his emotions. His state of mind didn't deteriorate compared to before. On the contrary, there was a faint smile on his face. No change was the biggest change. With Luo Fan's confidence in himself, it wasn't strange that he didn't feel any abnormalities in 100 years. However, after changing 2 completely different methods in 200 years, he didn't feel any abnormalities at all. This was an extremely inconceivable thing. Or rather, this was the biggest abnormality. Let me see what kind of power is controlling all of this behind the scenes. As he muttered, a Luo Fan that seemed to be condensed from the starry sky appeared on his body. It began to expand rapidly, crazily filling the endless void around him. This Luo Fan that seemed to be condensed from the starry sky was none other than his worldview of laws. Compared to the past, his current worldview of laws was more complicated, more mysterious, and more complete. Every bit of light that shone and flowed on it was enough to make any cultivator immersed in it. This worldview of laws continued to expand. Infinite power, infinite matter, and infinite space-time crazily gushed out from Luo Fan's body, constantly filling the worldview of laws. In the blink of an eye, this worldview of laws had transformed into a wider and more complete world of laws. It began to fill the surrounding vast and boundless void, constantly squeezing the existence of the void, causing the void to constantly compress in the process. The speed at which this world of laws expanded was too fast, causing the surrounding void to produce unprecedented distorted ripples due to the compression. It was like the halo of this world of laws, constantly expanding along with the expansion of the world of laws. At this moment, Luo Fan's perception integrated into the world of laws. With the help of the world of laws, he sensed all the changes inside and outside, searching for the source of the existence of this void. Or rather, the source of the existence of this void that he couldn't see through it all. The ripples caused by the expansion of the world of laws were immediately taken into his perception. At first, there was nothing unusual about the ripples. It was just like a kind of void that was being compressed. However, as time passed, as more and more ripples appeared, the strength of the ripples became stronger and stronger. Finally, he gradually saw what was special about the ripples. These aren't ordinary ripples. They're ripples that are similar to divine abilities. At a certain moment, Luo Fan made his own judgment. Ripples that were similar to divine abilities had extraordinary power. At the very least, they had traces of power that could be traced. In other words, it was very likely that these ripples weren't formed by the compression of ordinary void, but by some kind of power. If squeezing the surrounding nothingness could produce such ripples due to the squeezing of energy, didn't that mean that the vast and boundless nothingness in front of them was very likely to be a kind of mysterious energy? If it's really a power... At this moment, Luo Fan's eyes became unprecedentedly bright. Now that he had passed the fourth major tribulation, he could faintly sense the existence of the fifth major tribulation. What kind of power was able to completely conceal its existence from him, causing him to be unable to discover its existence for more than 200 years? What kind of incredible mystery was this power? Thinking of all these questions, even Luo Fan couldn't help but feel his heart pounding at this moment. He felt an indescribable desire in his body and mind, urging him to completely dissect all the mysteries of this power that might exist in front of him. Chapter 2080. For the current Luo Fan, even if it was the power of a true sage, he could still feel a trace of it. Even if the power of the true divine level was not hidden, he could even sense the endless mystery contained in it, just like sensing the mystery of the state of chaos. However, at this time, in the face of the power that had turned into nothingness in front of him, he could not feel the existence of any trace at all. This situation was something he had never seen or even heard of before. Could it be that this is a power that surpasses the true divine level? Involuntarily, such an almost impossible guess flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The power of the true divine level existed. Luo Fan was very clear about this from the beginning. Even if he did not know the existence of the true divine level at the beginning, he was very clear about this point. In his mind, there was no end to cultivation. As long as there was a certain level, there must be a realm above it. In other words, as long as there was the true divine level, there must be a realm above it. If one continued to extrapolate in this manner, there would naturally be a realm above the true divine realm, and so on, until there was no end. With this idea, he naturally understood that it was impossible for a power to exist without a certain level. However, even though he knew that the power of the true divine level existed, he did not think that the power in front of him was above the true divine level. There was no other reason than that this was the third level of the Tao Master's path. Everything that existed here was created by the true divine. In other words, unless the true divine had paid a great price to create this power. Otherwise, it was impossible for anything above the true divine level to appear here, regardless of power, or magic treasures, or other substances. It was all the same. Obviously, if this was the third level of the Tao Master's path, it would not be enough for the true divine to pay a great price to condense the power beyond the true divine level. Therefore, in his heart, he instinctively thought that his guess was almost impossible. All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind, but Luo Fan's movements did not slow down at all. Under his urging, the world of laws continued to spread in all directions. He wanted to figure out the nature of this power and find a way to get rid of it. Naturally, he had to try his best to trigger a change in this force. And at this time, the best way for him to make this force change was obviously to enrich the world of laws formed by his worldview of laws. Now, his worldview was much stronger than before. Although the entire world seemed to be incomplete, the structure vaguely had the charm of a perfect world. Under Luo Fan's control, its power was stimulated, its power fluctuated, and its concept surged. It was much stronger than when a normal perfect heaven and earth was pushed out. Under such circumstances, as time passed, the fluctuations caused by the world of laws grew more and more numerous. Those fluctuations were not completely independent of each other. Many of the fluctuations interfered and overlapped with each other in the process. It could be said that every ripple had an extremely profound effect on all the other ripples. Such a change was of great benefit to Luo Fan in understanding the characteristics of this power and comprehending the essence of this power. This void was vast and boundless. Even if the world of laws was constantly advancing, there were no signs of it being filled up. Time passed minute by minute, almost every minute and every second. The world of laws was growing and expanding, and so on and so forth. Unknowingly, 10,000 years had passed. After 10,000 years of development, the world of laws had long developed to an incredible level. The entire world had become boundless, and it felt even vaster than any world that Luo Fan had seen before. However, such a vast world of laws was still insignificant compared to the vast void. If there was a macroscopic perspective that could be seen from outside the void, the size of the world of laws and the void was still the same as when the world of laws was first born. However, compared to the size of the void, the many fluctuations of power that emerged because of the world of laws had increased by many times. Now, it had almost formed a barrier, completely enveloping the world of laws from all directions. At this point, looking from the outside, the world of laws seemed to be completely composed of endless fluctuations. One could imagine how dense the fluctuations were. It went without saying that the changes derived from such dense fluctuations and the nature of the power revealed were numerous. After 10,000 years of comprehension and observation, the various nature of the power had unknowingly accumulated in Luo Fan's mind. And this was barely enough for him to deduce the nature of the power. The expansion of the world could cause fluctuations of power, which naturally proved that the expansion of the world of laws could affect that power. It also proved that that power could affect the world of laws in turn. In this way, the larger the world expanded, the greater the reaction of the power it had to withstand. It felt like as the world continued to expand, the resistance it encountered would become greater and greater as time passed, and as the world grew larger. This increase in resistance would inevitably affect Luo Fan one day, and it would inevitably make Luo Fan unable to push the world to expand even a little bit after 10,000 years of development. This moment had arrived very quickly. On a certain day, 10,000 years later, when Luo Fan couldn't make the world of laws expand even a little no matter how hard he pushed, he knew that this was already the limit. He had long expected this, so he wasn't surprised to encounter such an obstacle. He didn't hesitate at all. With a slight thought, he directly dispersed the surrounding world of laws. The world of laws was formed from the time, space, matter, and energy he created himself, and then combined with his worldview of laws. Everything in it was completely under his absolute control. If he wanted to disperse it, he could naturally do it easily and silently. He didn't need to do it like ordinary cultivators who wanted to destroy a certain part of the world. He had to completely shatter the world, detonate the power within it, and produce an earth-shattering sound and light effect to achieve his goal. Therefore, the whole process of dispersing the world of laws was extremely smooth and easy. Everything in the world instantly lost its restraints and gradually melted into the surrounding endless fluctuations. It was devoured by the fluctuations and neutralized with them. In the end, the two were completely annihilated and disappeared without a trace. When the entire world of laws completely disappeared, The endless fluctuations of power that completely enveloped the world of laws also disappeared without a trace at the same time. It was as if it had never appeared before. The surroundings were restored to the initial barren and nothingness. I've obtained another property. Looking at this scene, such a thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. Obviously, he hadn't expected the world of laws to be annihilated at the same time as the fluctuations. Now that this change had occurred, he had a further understanding of the nature of that power. At that moment, he didn't hesitate. He directly sat cross-legged in the nothingness, closed his eyes, and began to constantly adjust and integrate the nature of the hundreds of thousands of types of power in his heart. Changes. The outline of this power that was like absolute nothingness began to gradually emerge in his heart during this process. This outline was naturally extremely crude at the beginning, and it couldn't even compare to the punch of any mortal. After all, the punch of a mortal was pure fist force. Even if it was scattered and a lot of it was wasted, this essence wouldn't change. However, the outline of the power that he had condensed at the very beginning was a mess. The power within it was intertwined everywhere, colliding with each other and destroying each other. If he really condensed it in this way, the power would probably explode the moment it appeared. He had naturally expected this situation, but he wasn't surprised. He just began to adjust the outline of this power through his own comprehension, eliminating the contradictions and disharmony little by little. He slowly carved out the crudeness of it with his own wisdom. He used his own accumulation to deduce the true appearance of this power. It goes without saying how big of a project it was to combine hundreds of thousands of properties in the right way. Even Luo Fan spent thousands of years to finally obtain 18 types of power that contained hundreds of thousands of properties at the same time. These 18 types of power were all different. It could be said that any one of them was completely different from the other 17. Each of them had their own characteristics and their own inclinations. Among the 18 types of power that contained hundreds of thousands of properties, only one of them was the power that had turned into nothingness at this moment. As for which one to choose, it was obviously not something that could be answered by further deduction. Immediately, Luo Fan opened his eyes. His heart stirred slightly, and the veins on his face bulged. The law power and the law view of the world were mobilized to the greatest extent. All kinds of mysterious and subtle changes evolved during this process with the law power and the law view of the world. Wisps of power that surpassed the law of Dharma, power, gradually formed on his palm. The moment these wisps of power were formed, Luo Fan felt an unimaginable pressure. With a loud bang, an earth-shattering explosion occurred in the surrounding void. A terrifying impact instantly swept the surroundings, including Luo Fan, who was in the center of the explosion and holding the source of the explosion in his hand. Looks like it's not this power. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The terrifying explosion was caused by the collision of two extremely high-level powers. Normally, it would be enough to blast a perfect world back to the beginning of the world. However, at this moment, when Luo Fan was already prepared, he only felt pain in his body. It couldn't even injure him. Of course, this was not because Luo Fan was powerful enough to completely ignore these two powers. In fact, the reason why such a situation had occurred was because he had condensed a portion of the energy. Therefore, he was able to control that energy to a certain extent, although this kind of control was greatly reduced when the two collided with each other. Even the little bit of control after the reduction was enough to play a considerable role in his hands. For example, he could make the impact produced by the collision of the two go around him. However, the appearance of this conflict meant that the power he chose was wrong. It also represented a fact. That was, his deduction that this nothingness was a type of power was completely correct. If it wasn't power, how could it cause such a strong conflict with the power he condensed? Therefore, although it was a failure. But after this, Luo Fan was even more confident. At that moment, he didn't hesitate. After the impact from the clash had completely subsided, he opened his right hand, and all the power in his body boiled. The power of the law world view surged, and not long after, strands of power condensed in his palm. Almost the same change as before happened at the same time. This power had just condensed. It caused an intense reaction with the surrounding nothingness, forming an extremely powerful collision. Terrifying shock waves erupted and swept in all directions. After a long time, everything finally calmed down, still not. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan sighed his heart and began to condense the third power. Just like this, similar situations began to occur. Finally, when he condensed the 14th power, the changes in his surroundings were finally different from the previous intense reaction. He saw, at this moment, the strands of power on his palm began to disperse and drill into the surrounding nothingness. Then, it began to tremble slightly, causing some subtle changes in the surrounding nothingness. I finally found it. It's actually this power. Looks like my luck is just average. At this moment, Luo Fan let out a long breath. In the end, he found the 14th of the 18 powers. Although his luck was better than finding the last power, it was still not that good. After finding this power, the composition of the other 17 powers was instantly hidden in the depths of his heart. This kind of power that could connect with the surrounding nothingness was continuously condensed by him as it stood out. It gathered in his hand and then spread out through his palm into the surroundings. He strengthened the connection that he had established with the surrounding nothingness. Without the interference of other powers, Luo Fan focused all of his attention on this power that stood out. As he focused all of his attention, all kinds of inspirations that he had never had before appeared in his heart. At a certain moment, his heart was filled with inspiration. A bolt of lightning pierced through his heart. This is actually the power of a true divine that has been distorted. With such inspiration, he carefully comprehended this power. In an instant, its essence had already appeared. In this power, there was a kind of eternal, indestructible, all-encompassing and all-encompassing quality. This was the quality that only a true divine level power had. Besides this quality, there was also a concept that Luo Fan was extremely familiar with. It was the concept of nothingness. It was the combination of these two that formed the vast and boundless nothingness around Luo Fan. Luo Fan could sense the power of a true divine level, and he was also quite familiar with the concept of nothingness. However, the combination of these two had produced a change that he could not understand at all, causing the final form of the power to be completely beyond the scope of his understanding. The mysterious evolution of the power was really amazing. After understanding the truth of this power, countless inspirations exploded in Luo Fan's heart, and all kinds of new ideas about the power kept emerging. Combined with the nature of the hundreds of thousands of powers that he had comprehended through the fluctuations of the power, his understanding of the power had reached a level that was unimaginable in the past. It's indeed impossible to completely construct this kind of power, but there shouldn't be a problem if it's similar to it to a certain extent. He muttered as he lifted his hand to disperse the strands of power that were still connected to his palm. Immediately afterward, the concept of nothingness that was extracted from the worldview of laws began to react with the frantically increasing power of laws, and wisps of power began to regenerate on his palm. This kind of power seemed to be worlds apart from the original power. It was almost completely different from the surrounding nothingness. However, after such power appeared, the surrounding nothingness began to have an unprecedented strong reaction. In fact, there was even no need for Luo Fan to take the initiative to pour this power into the surroundings. The nothingness had already naturally dispelled this power and took the initiative to integrate it into itself. At the same time, Luo Fan could clearly sense that a closer connection than the previous power had appeared in his heart. In a trance, he seemed to be able to integrate into the nothingness at will and transcend it. Sure enough, it seems that the third level that I entered is not the third level that ordinary cultivators enter, but the third level that the Tao Master's disciples enter. A kind of enlightenment emerged in his heart. When he found out that the second level of the Tao Master's path was divided into two parts, he already knew that the third level and even higher levels of the Tao Master's path would probably have a similar structure. In other words, the Tao Master's disciples would be divided into two parts, and the Tao Master's disciples would monopolize the part with a good cultivation environment, while the rest of the cultivators could only cultivate in the remaining areas. Chapter 2081. The disciples of the Tao Master were the direct disciples of the Tao Master. Such an existence must have a deep understanding of the power of the Tao Master level. With such knowledge, they might not be able to instantly understand the truth when they see the nothingness in front of them or something similar to the nothingness. However, if they knew the truth beforehand, they would definitely be able to catch traces of it faster than any other rogue cultivator. Through the various exquisite methods imparted by the Tao Master, it would be a matter of course if they wanted to break free from the restrictions of this power. However, it was different for those so-called rogue cultivators who were not disciples of the Tao Master. If they did not have enough opportunities, ordinary rogue cultivators might have heard of the Tao Master and heard that the Tao Master had unimaginable power, but they would definitely not be able to see it with their own eyes. For such an existence, unless they could be like Luo Fan and use their own extraordinary knowledge to deduce it from the side, it would be absolutely impossible for them to discover the essence of this power. Naturally, it would be even more impossible for them to break free from the shackles of this power and truly enter the third level of the Tao Master path that was exclusively occupied by the Tao Master's disciples. Of course, it was obviously impossible for them to be unable to step into the third level because of this. After all, no matter how powerful the Tao Master's disciples were, it was impossible for them to completely ignore the true meaning of the Tao Master's path and completely cut off the cultivation path of the rogue cultivators. Therefore, perhaps after a period of time, there would be other changes that would guide them to step into the third level. However, the third level that they would enter would no longer be the part that could be entered by breaking the shackles. All these thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The power that was split out from his hands had already trembled, and the surrounding nothingness was slightly distorted out of nowhere. This distortion was so weak that it could not even be compared to the fluctuation caused by the world of law that he had created previously. However, even if it was a weak distortion, its essence was already many times stronger than that fluctuation. That fluctuation, it was some kind of strange phenomenon that was caused by an external force. However, this distortion was a kind of strange phenomenon that was produced from the inside out. What it represented was the internal transformation. An external force would only cause the power to backfire. If one wanted to rely on such an attack to break through the shackles of this power, it would only be possible if the strength or quality of the attack exceeded this power. Obviously, if one wanted to defeat the power of the true saint level combined with the concept of nothingness, one could only do so if one's cultivation realm had reached the same level as a true saint. If one could reach that level, why would one still need to cultivate on the Tao Master path? Therefore, it was obviously impossible to break the shackles of this power by using external attacks. However, the distortion caused by the internal changes was different. Distortion from within. What changed was the power itself. Even if the power resisted, it was only the interaction between the internal powers. In this way, if he wanted to break the shackles of this power, he naturally didn't need to be comparable to this power in terms of quantity and quality. He only needed to be able to change the shackles of this power to disappear, although it was still not easy. However, compared to the original impossible progress, it was clearly many times better. And now, the method that Luo Fan chose was precisely this method. In the midst of the distortion of the nothingness, the surrounding nothingness that could not be seen at all began to reveal traces. Traces of the flow of power appeared in front of him. In a trance, the surrounding nothingness was no longer like before. Instead, there were more strands of power. It seemed to have turned into some indescribable rule that supported the nothingness. This power was so mysterious, and its quality was so high. Just the strands of it, which were like willow catkins, had already emitted an indescribable pressure, crushing Luo Fan's body from all directions. At this moment, infinite light flashed in Luo Fan's mind. He didn't know how much information flowed in the air. In a trance, it was as though he had entered a universe of power. Everything he could think of, unimaginable power existed in this universe of power in an indescribable way. It really is the power of the true saint level. At this moment, this thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind that was still clear. Then, he put all these thoughts aside and began to comprehend the power wholeheartedly. Although stepping into the third level of the Tao Master's path was also extremely important to him. However, don't forget why he stepped into the third level of the Tao Master's path. What he wanted was to cultivate, to raise his cultivation level. Under such circumstances, if there was a place that could allow him to cultivate better than stepping into the third level and improve his cultivation realm, he would never give up just because he wanted to step into the third level. The strands of power that he had sublimated by combining the Dharma power of law and the power of nothingness extracted from the worldview of law had an indescribable close connection with the true saint-level power that had been distorted by the concept of nothingness. He could sense this power not only by relying on what he saw at this moment, but also the strands of power that existed in the endless nothingness around him like willow catkins. He could also sense it through the connection between the two. Moreover, in contrast, the connection between the two brought about a stronger feeling, which allowed him to gain more benefits. In this process, he faintly felt that his cultivation realm seemed to be improving bit by bit, and his understanding of the concept of nothingness was also improving at an unimaginable speed. After all, the concept of nothingness was formed by the combination of the concept of nothingness and the power of the true saint level. The concept of nothingness contained in it was naturally extremely perfect and of an extremely high level. Under such circumstances, comprehending this power would naturally allow him to understand the concept of nothingness, comprehend it, and gain benefits, which was also a matter of course. Time flew by, and before he knew it, nearly 100,000 years had passed. On this day, an inexplicable feeling interrupted Luo Fan's process of comprehending the power. If I don't leave, this power will send me to the cultivation place of the rogue cultivators. He could not help but sigh as he carefully felt this feeling. Calculating the time, it had been almost 100,000 years since he stepped into the nothingness. It seemed that these 100,000 years, this was the longest time that the disciples of the Tao Masters left for the latecomers. What a pity. When he realized this situation, he could only sigh inwardly and stop comprehending the power. He began to mobilize the power that was formed by the combination of the concept and the Dharma power of laws that he had integrated into it, and with the help of his understanding of the vast power in the outside world in the past 100,000 years. With great difficulty, he opened a passage in the nothingness, a passage that led to the outside world. In other words, a passage to escape the shackles of this power. Compared to the difference between the third level where the disciples of the Tao Masters were and the third level where the rogue cultivators were, it was obviously not worth it to stay here to comprehend this power. In other words, even if he could stay in this power to continue comprehending it, he wouldn't make such a choice. Not to mention, the power did not give him a choice to stay here at all. If he did not leave, the power would directly send him to the third level where the rogue cultivators were cultivating. In this way, there was no need to say more about what he should choose. However, although it was only 100,000 years, these 100,000 years of cultivation had brought him benefits that were enough to make him excited. At least, his understanding of the concept of nothingness had unknowingly approached the understanding of the concept of immortality in the past 100,000 years. It should be known that when he was on the second level of the Tao Master's Road, he had spent hundreds of millions of years to achieve the sublimation of the concept of immortality with the help of the indestructible world, allowing the concept of immortality to stand out and surpass all other concepts in the world of laws. It had almost become the core of the world of laws. Now, he had only comprehended the power of the true divine level in less than 100,000 years, but he had already caught up to the gains that he had made in hundreds of millions of years. This huge difference was enough to show how incredible the power of the true divine level was. After all, it was the power of the true divine level. Even if he had used the power that was integrated into it to mobilize the changes and open a passage to leave. But at the same time, it brought him immense pressure. At this moment, his whole body seemed to be crushed by hundreds of millions of worlds at the same time. There was a feeling that in the next moment, he would be completely crushed, and even his own concept of existence would be completely erased. Against such a terrifying pressure, Luo Fan could only gather his strength with great difficulty and step into the passage step by step. At the moment when he was about to be completely immersed in it, he turned his head and looked at the place that he had been comprehending for 100,000 years. The place of nothingness that had brought him a huge harvest had a look of regret in its eyes. It was a kind of joy. Then, he turned his head and resolutely entered the passage. As he entered the passage, the surrounding light and shadow changed rapidly. Time, space, matter, energy, rules of law, everything began to change wildly at this time. It felt as if everything was being thrown into a blender to be ground and mixed. This change was so great and so resolute that even Luo Fan could not grasp the law of the change at this time, let alone know what the final result of this change would be. The only thing he could do now was to wait for everything around him to calm down. However, as he stayed in this passage for a long time, he felt that the pressure from the power that came from the combination of the concept of nothingness became smaller and smaller. He did not know how long it took, but it also seemed as if it had been billions of years. The pressure finally disappeared completely, and the surrounding light and shadow changed completely. An incomparably wondrous scene was reflected in his eyes. This is the third level of the Tao Master's Road. Looking at the wonderful scene in front of him, Luo Fan could not help but murmur. The scene in front of him was completely different from what he had imagined the third level to be. Here it was just a boundless and wondrous world. There was no starry sky, no nothingness, no strange scenery at all. There was only a place that looked extremely ordinary and seemed to have nothing special or unusual. If he did not have enough confidence in himself that he had arrived at the third level of the Tao Master's Road, he might have suspected that he had directly left the Tao Master's Road through the passage and returned to the Tao Master Great World. Is it like the first level, where I need to break through this world to enter the true location of the third level of the Tao Master's Road? Such a thought flashed through his mind. He was about to float up and see the whole picture of this world, looking for a possible way to break through it. But, just as his will flowed out and he was about to instinctively mobilize his power to lift himself off the ground, he found something unexpected. His power disappeared. It could not be said that it disappeared. Rather, it should be said that all the abilities and effects that his power could trigger had disappeared. In other words, he could still mobilize his power, still be able to manipulate his power, and even his physical strength was no different than before. But all the possible effects of all this. But not a single one of them was left behind. It was as if the world didn't acknowledge any of this. The world would counteract the effects of his various abilities whenever he used them, making him look like an ordinary creature that had lost all of its power and abilities. How is this possible? Luo Fan frowned at this time. He had experienced many worlds, and he had created countless worlds. He had seen many worlds that could limit the power levels of cultivators and living beings who entered them. He did not even know how many he had created. But no matter what kind of world it was, whether it was created by him or by other creatures, any heaven and earth should not have any effect on him now. With the perfection of his current worldview of laws, he could barely survive in the state of chaos for a little while. How could the rules of heaven and earth be able to completely break through this worldview of laws and directly affect him, who was under the protection of the worldview of laws? But at this time, in this world, such a situation. But it happened. How could he not be shocked? With a thought, Luo Fan stopped what he was doing. He stood on the ground and began to look around, observing the world in front of him. He wanted to feel the essence of this world. It wasn't just his might that was being restricted. His power, his perception, and his willpower were also being restricted. At this moment, he was completely unable to use his perception, which should have been able to grasp all the details of the entire world with a sweep of his eyes. He could only rely on his own eyes to observe this world and feel its secrets. He was standing in front of a stone door. This stone door was 30 feet tall, and it looked like it was built by casually taking 3 cylindrical stones of different lengths and putting them together. There was no special aura coming from the stone door, and he could not tell that it was connected to any power at all. He could not tell that it could guide him out of it. The location of this stone door was in a desert. It was surrounded by gravel and gravel. At a glance, there was no sign of life, and it looked so desolate. Raising his head to look at the sky, there was a huge sun hanging in the western direction. Endless light and heat were emitted from the sun, illuminating the entire world. At least, it illuminated the place where Luo Fan was at this moment. What a wonderful world! Looking at all this, Luo Fan could not help but praise. This part of the world looked so normal, and that was the biggest abnormality. Although the effects of all of Luo Fan's power had been restricted, his eyesight had not been erased. With his knowledge, even if he stepped into the Tao Master Great World, he could still feel the mystery, the various structures, and the mysteries of the rules. Under such circumstances, when he stepped into this world in front of him, he did not see any mystery at all, which he could perceive even in the Tao Master Great World. Wasn't this the biggest mystery? Wasn't this the biggest mystery? Bending down, he picked up a stone at his feet. This stone was extremely heavy, and that kind of weight, pressed against his hand, made him feel as if he had returned to the time when he was an ordinary person before he transmigrated. In terms of absolute weight, such a stone had to be at least billions of trillions of trillions of trillions of trillions of trillions of kilograms stacked together in order to achieve such an effect. And this could almost be said to be the weight of several heavens and earth at this moment. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat, and he suddenly felt a strange feeling coming from the stone. This is heaven and earth. At this moment, his expression changed slightly, and he suddenly remembered what this strange feeling represented. That was the feeling of the existence of heaven and earth. Sensing the existence of this heaven and earth, his expression changed slightly. Following this feeling, he slowly probed his mind to find this feeling, to deepen this feeling, and to see the truth of what might be the existence of heaven and earth. Only at this time, when this feeling came from the stone, could he do this. After all, the feeling was mutual. Since there was a feeling coming from inside the stone, he could naturally use this feeling to sense the other party. With the means of Luo Fan, this was almost an instinct. Otherwise, all the effects of his power in this world would have been neutralized. Even his perception was no exception. However, it would have been impossible for him to extend his perception into the stone to sense the mysteries within it. Chapter 2082. There was a world in every grain of sand and a world in every leaf. Luo Fan had already heard this sentence before he transmigrated. After he transmigrated to the primordial world and embarked on cultivation, this sentence was proven almost everywhere. It was so big that there were countless worlds and perfect worlds in any point of the chaos. It was so small that there might be countless worlds in a certain Dharma treasure. However, no matter what kind of structure it was, no matter what kind of world it was, the world in every grain of sand and the world in every leaf he knew were not as good as the stone in front of him. One had to know that what existed in this stone was not an ordinary world. It was a world that was similar to a perfect world. A perfect world could exist in a state of chaos for a long time. There was even hope that it would become a great world after surviving the 9 great tribulations of heaven and earth and exist in the state of chaos forever. Normally speaking, such a world would probably occupy a huge proportion even in the great world. It cannot be treated lightly. And now, in the stone that he randomly picked up, there was such a world that was similar to a perfect world. This was simply subverting all his ideas and telling him that his understanding of cultivation in the past was wrong. With a thought, he put down the stone in his hand and picked up a stone that was hundreds of times smaller than the stone. It could only be regarded as a grain of sand. This sand-like stone was hundreds of times smaller and lighter than the original stone. He picked it up. However, it felt rather relaxed. After picking up this gravel, Luo Fan was slightly shocked. The inexplicable feeling that came from the stone appeared again. There was also a world inside the gravel in front of him. With this feeling, he probed it with his perception. After carefully sensing the inside of the gravel, he quickly discovered that the world inside was also similar to a perfect world. However, its size was only a few hundred times smaller than the world from before. Facing such a situation, the shock on Luo Fan's face became even more obvious. Next, he began to continuously pick up stones. He checked the gravel and the soil bit by bit. As he checked, he finally discovered a fact that he did not know how to react. Everything in front of him, including the stones, the gravel, and the soil, contained a world of its own. Moreover, they were all worlds that were similar to perfect worlds. So that's how it is. Luo Fan no longer found it incomprehensible that the third level of the Tao Master's path was an ordinary world like this. If all the materials in this world were like this, and all the materials contained such a world, then this world would be like this. It was at least 1,000 times stronger than the second stage of the road to Tao Master. If one could master the mysteries and cultivation tips, the benefits one could obtain here would definitely be 1,000 times more than in the second layer of the road to Tao Master. It's really a big deal. Looking into the distance, he couldn't see the end of the Gobi Desert. If every single bit of material was taken out and counted, there would be billions and trillions of trillions and trillions of materials here. In other words, they had the same number of worlds. It was impossible for a complete world to only consist of the Gobi Desert. In other words, there must be even more vast terrains outside this vast and boundless Gobi Desert. If the materials in it were the same structure as the one in front of him, then the number of almost perfect worlds that could be contained in this world was almost beyond the limit of what could be described with numbers. It was overkill for such an existence to be at the third level of the road to Tao Master. It was like begging for food with a golden bowl. Even if it was placed in the fourth, fifth, or even the sixth level, he felt that such a world was enough. However, it was also because of this that he had a stronger expectation for the fourth, fifth, sixth, and even higher levels of the road to Tao Master. Even the third level was like this. What would the higher levels look like? What more incredible mysteries would there be? Luo Fan stood there quietly, looking indifferent, but his heart was filled with an inexplicable fighting spirit. He began to walk, step by step, towards the east of this world like an ordinary person. The place where the sun rose was the east. At least, as far as he knew, it was the east. He walked like this step by step. His body seemed so heavy. The harsh environment around him was constantly eroding his body. The sun that was scorching the earth was like the most terrifying flame he had ever encountered, constantly burning his body. Even though his body was firmly protected by the worldview of rules, it was still faintly unbearable. His sweat, which contained boundless power and vitality, was constantly evaporating from his body and dispersing into the air. At the same time, the ground below was constantly emitting heat, evaporating his body. At the same time, the water in his body was constantly being consumed, causing him to constantly be consumed in this process. Such a process was simply fatal for ordinary cultivators, enough to make them panic and discouraged. However, this was so natural and easy for Luo Fan. Even if he had turned into an ordinary person and was constantly being consumed by the outside world, the fighting spirit in his eyes was not affected at all. It was as if that kind of loss was nothing to him, as if it didn't count for anything. He didn't even pay the slightest bit of attention to the damage to his body. Instead, he focused all his attention on the east, taking one step at a time towards his goal. After walking for half a day, he also understood that kind of unimaginably terrifying consumption wasn't really uncontrollable. It was just a test of the world for living beings, reducing the performance of any existence to the level of ordinary living beings, no matter how powerful they were. As long as certain methods and techniques were used, the consumption could naturally be reduced. In fact, it could even be achieved without any consumption. At this moment, what Luo Fan was doing, that was obviously the case. The power of laws in his body surged. He constantly adjusted the state of his body, adjusting himself to the same state as the outside environment. Although all of his extraordinary powers could not leave his body to produce any effects at this time and could not cause any extraordinary changes to this world. However, he was still able to control the internal adjustments and changes in his body. In this case, the adjustment in front of him was naturally possible for him, as his own state was adjusted in this way. The influence of the harsh environment of the outside world on him had gradually disappeared. Perhaps, to the outside world, the current him was already part of that kind of harsh environment. He was part of the operation of the laws of the entire world. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for it to affect him anymore. The consumption that was like scraping his bones and searching his marrow naturally disappeared completely. Faced with such a change, there was only an indescribable joy on Luo Fan's face. He stood there quietly with an inexplicable calmness in his eyes, but he began to speed up. Even ordinary people, after training, they could greatly increase their speed, let alone Luo Fan. With his understanding of himself and his various knowledge of divine abilities, it was a simple matter for him to use the body of an ordinary living being to do all kinds of things that surpassed the level of ordinary living beings. Increasing his running speed and reducing his consumption was just a matter of whether he was willing or not. Under such circumstances, in less than half a day, his speed was already like that of a galloping horse, and the consumption was unimaginably small. In fact, every consumption could be completely offset by a special breathing method. In other words, it was equivalent to no consumption at all. In order to maintain this state, Luo Fan was wholeheartedly controlling his body at this moment. Every strand of muscle and every trace of power in his body were used to the limit. At this moment, his body's posture was so mysterious that any martial arts grandmaster would worship it. In fact, if a martial arts grandmaster with real comprehension saw each of his movements, they would probably be able to rely on this impression to open up an indescribably huge cultivation system and become an ancestor. After running like this for 3 days and 3 nights, Luo Fan finally saw a bit of green in the distant horizon. The appearance of this bit of green meant that he was finally about to walk out of this extremely barren Gobi desert. This also proved that his initial guess was correct. This world really did not just have a neighboring world, but also a variety of other terrains. I wonder if the material in the green field is the same as here. Looking at the green field from afar, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and his expression became expectant. At this moment, his figure was incomparably graceful. Every move he made triggered some kind of indescribable force from the outside world, or rather, some kind of indescribable mechanism produced a kind of subtle change. The effect on his body was to a great extent, and it greatly offset the restraint this world had on him in a certain aspect, the restraint of gravity. This restraint was so strong that it was precisely because of this that he could not fly in the sky and could only run like an ordinary person. After this restraint was weakened, the weight of his body seemed to be reduced by 100 times. The elegance of his movements almost surpassed the limits of ordinary people and directly reached a state that could only be achieved by extraordinary means. In this world that completely restricted the effects of all extraordinary powers, it was simply beyond common sense. It was as if he had already broken the fundamental rules of this world. However, in reality, this was only on the surface. In fact, this situation was completely in line with the fundamental rules of this world. Because at this time, Luo Fan's near-transcendent technique was not triggered by the transcendent power in his body. In other words, it wasn't triggered by his law power or other powers such as willpower. It was just the transcendent power triggered by his actions. It was like a very ordinary world. Some creatures did not have any extraordinary powers, but they could use language. With the help of hand gestures and body movements, he achieved an effect similar to mastering extraordinary power, such as the legendary witchcraft. What Luo Fan was doing now was something similar. However, compared to the effects of the ordinary creatures in the world, the method he used was much more effective. It was just that it was many times more powerful. This world restricted any creature that stepped into it from using transcendent power, but it was obviously impossible to restrict the power of the world itself. What he was doing now was using his own movements and posture to mobilize the power of the world itself to help him. It was also because all of his current transcendent means were restricted that he could not use his extraordinary perception to sense the laws of this world, and could only rely on his eyes to observe the various phenomena of this world to deduce the laws of the world. This was why he could only achieve this effect after 3 days and could only barely perform this kind of method that was similar to the lightning technique. However, with this method, it was like opening a door, a window, allowing him to finally have a clue and starting point to comprehend the transcendent power of this world. From now on, as long as there was enough time, he would definitely be able to deduce a cultivation system that involved all aspects, and could even improve his own cultivation system through cultivation, opening the path of cultivation in this world. While thinking about it, Luo Fan began to gradually approach the green color. In less than 10 minutes, he had really seen the first kind of green in this world. It was a Gobi desert with sparse weeds. From here, it continued to grow outwards. Finally, after hundreds of miles, it had completely turned into ordinary green land, no longer the terrain of the Gobi Desert. Looking up into the distance, he could faintly see the mountains and misty clouds. Smoke! Suddenly, Luo Fan frowned. He saw a wisp of smoke rising from the horizon in the distance, slowly falling into the sky and disappearing without a trace. The presence of smoke meant that there was human habitation. It meant that there was an intelligent creature living there. There are also indigenous people in this world. This thought emerged in his mind. If it was a cultivator who came from the town master's path, no matter how much weaker he was than Luo Fan, he must be an extremely brilliant existence, and self-sufficient was inevitable. In other words, if it was really a cultivator who had ascended like Luo Fan, then he must not need to eat or drink, and naturally would not be able to produce smoke, which could only appear in the mortal world. After understanding this, his judgment naturally came to fruition. I have to take a good look. Thinking this in his heart, he did not immediately take action and go to the place where the smoke was rising. Instead, he bent down and began to examine the materials of the various things under his feet. This included soil, sand, water, and for the first time, green plants. After a brief examination, he already understood that the nature of these things was not much different from that of the stones. Similarly, there was a nearly perfect world within it. If there was anything different, it would be that the nature of different materials was different. The world inside the lifeless materials was more inclined to chaos, and the less life there was, the more intense the chaos. In this kind of chaos, all living beings born in this world were struggling on the line between life and death. No matter how powerful they were, even if they could destroy the world and other worlds and could transcend, they could still be killed by incomparably weak living beings at any time. On the other hand, the closer the materials were to life, such as water, the more orderly they were. This kind of order caused the development of the world inside them to be much faster and more stable than the world inside the lifeless materials. Among them, the peak was the world with life, such as the world inside the green plants. The order of the world inside the green plants was so perfect that it could even give birth to a civilization that could carry out sustainable development. Even if it was extremely weak, it could continue to sublimate and improve through the accumulation of time, and finally reach an unbelievable height. After roughly sorting out the corresponding relationship between the materials in the world and the world inside, Luo Fan faintly had an inexplicable feeling in his heart. However, this feeling was still vague, and it was difficult to explain for the time being, so there was no need to talk about it. After checking the things he was most concerned about, Luo Fan stood up, clapped his hands, and began to fly towards the place where the smoke was without hesitation. Although the smoke could already be seen by Luo Fan, in reality, Luo Fan was still quite a distance away from where the smoke was. In the end, even though Luo Fan headed straight for the smoke without taking any detours, it still took him almost 4 hours to get close to the place where the smoke was rising. The place where the smoke was already full of vitality. There were green plants everywhere, and more small animals were hidden among the plants, surviving by relying on the ecosystem formed by the plants. Those small animals looked no different from ordinary animals in the world, and there was nothing strange about them. This made this place look like an ordinary world. Based on the traces of extraordinary power that Luo Fan had mastered through his movements, naturally existing creatures, even fierce tigers, were not much of a threat to him, let alone these small animals. Therefore, along the way, he would occasionally stop to check on these small animals to confirm his previous guess. Chapter 2083. What appeared in front of Luo Fan was a village. It wasn't a big village with only 100 or so households. It was a small village that would look ordinary in any world, and it wouldn't be surprising if it appeared anywhere. The smoke he saw from afar came from a huge chimney at the center of the village. Such a village, which would look ordinary anywhere, appeared in front of him at this moment. Luo Fan couldn't believe his eyes. The village looked extremely ordinary. There were old people and children chatting leisurely, playing, and fooling around. There were also strong men and women busy with farming. Around the village, there were large tracts of fertile farmland that had been reclaimed. All kinds of crops were planted on them. There were even poultry and pets running around. Such a scene, if placed in any world, would be so ordinary. But in this world, it was strange no matter how he looked at it. It should be noted that every grain of sand, every stone, every blade of grass, every leaf had its own heaven and earth, a heaven and earth with its own world. No matter how one looked at it, ordinary should be isolated from this world. Yet, under such circumstances, right in front of him, a scene that looked so ordinary and normal had appeared in front of him 100 years ago. How could he not be surprised? At that moment, Luo Fan did not hesitate and unhurriedly walked toward the village. If he wanted to understand the situation in this world, he had to come into contact with the living beings in this world, whether they were natives or cultivators. Although the village was small, it was also divided into various functions. At the entrance of the village, there were also people guarding it. Soon, they noticed Luo Fan's appearance. Immediately, a strong man appeared at the intersection, blocked in front of Luo Fan, and said, "This is a fellow villager. This is a fellow from the same hometown. Who are you looking for in our village?" Luo Fan sized up the strong man. He didn't have any extraordinary senses at the moment, so he could see completely different things from close to and from far away. Just now, he only had a rough look from afar, but he couldn't see through these people. Now that he was closer, he could finally see some clues. Each of them also had a world within their bodies. Furthermore, it was not just a single world, but an unknown number of worlds. Compared to a cultivator like Luo Fan who had gone through countless tempering and tempering for countless trillions of years, that structure was incomparable to that of a cultivator. Naturally, it was much cruder. However, in terms of level, he should have reached the level of a first tribulation expert. Such an existence would not be able to display any extraordinary power, even in this world. However, he should be able to be self-sufficient from the inside. Not to mention anything else, eating, drinking, and taking a dump in the mortal world could not be avoided. However, according to the village they formed, there was still smoke and crops. Judging from their rations, it was obvious that they were not self-sufficient. They still needed to constantly absorb materials and energy from the outside world to maintain their own survival. This situation was just like begging with a golden rice bowl. Luo Fan couldn't figure out why it was like this. But now, after looking at the muscular man up close, he had completely figured it out. This was because they were born with this structure. It was completely out of their control, and it was even to the extent that they couldn't sense it. It was exactly because of this that they were born with unbelievable strength. Even if they were in this world, they could live well like mortals, and they didn't have to worry at all. Even a rock in this world weighed trillions of kilograms. However, it was exactly because of this that they didn't cultivate at all. If one wanted to be self-sufficient and not rely on external forces, then the most basic requirement was to attain the first heaven golden immortal realm. Only by attaining the first heaven golden immortal realm and being able to establish a world and create living beings would one be able to produce sufficient energy within one's body to satisfy all one's needs and attain self-sufficiency without relying on external forces. Without such a realm, it was impossible for one to be self-sufficient, even if one possessed strength that could destroy the world. Just like the living beings that were born in this world. Even though the strength they possessed was sufficient to crush countless first heaven golden immortal realm cultivators, they were unable to attain self-sufficiency and not rely on external forces like first heaven golden immortal realm cultivators were capable of. In their opinion, their strength was constantly counteracting the pressure of this world and the corrosion of this world towards them, and it was utilized to maintain the normal circulation of this body. The consumption of energy at every single moment caused them to have to consume food every once in a while in order to maintain their bodies from collapsing. What a pity. When he figured out all of this, Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh in his heart. This brawny man had grasped such terrifying power, but he couldn't even break free from the restriction of food. This was simply a reckless waste of resources. Moreover, because of their innate nature, it would be thousands of times more difficult for them to break free from this restriction in the future compared to ordinary living beings. After all, because of the environment they lived in, their senses towards energy had become dull to the point that even the living beings with the lowest natural endowments and the least intelligence surpassed them by thousands of times. If they were sensitive, then they would naturally be living in fear of this world at all times. How could they have survived until now? There is no need to mention exactly how difficult it was to advance one's cultivation to the first heaven golden immortal realm with such a slow reaction. It could be said that unless their natural endowments were heaven-defying, it was simply impossible for them to succeed. To possess such formidable strength, yet be completely cut off from cultivation, and even have no hope of transcending it, such an encounter was tragic no matter how one looked at it. Of course, such thoughts were only circulating in Luo Fan's mind. It was impossible for him to show it directly. At this moment, he simply found a few excuses and managed to convince the robust man. He accepted him to settle down in the village. As for what excuses he found, there was no need to elaborate. With Luo Fan's experience that spanned billions of trillions of years and millions of worlds, it would only take a few hours for him to become the master of this village and make everyone in it his slaves, let alone settle down. Settling down in this village was Luo Fan's whim. It was a thought that came to him after he saw the village. As for the reason, it was naturally very simple. He came to this world. Everything was unfamiliar. Did it not matter where he stayed? Did it matter where he stayed? It made no difference to him whether he chose this village or any other place. If that was the case, then why waste time choosing other places? Wouldn't it be better to just settle down in this village? In any case, with the cultivation environment of this world, this place alone was enough to support his cultivation, allowing him to obtain a cultivation environment that was more perfect than the second level of the Road of Tao Master. Integrating into this village, it was not difficult for Luo Fan at all. In just a few days, everyone in this village already felt that he was no different from a native of this village and truly accepted him as a part of this village. At this point, Luo Fan began to take action. First, he transformed his understanding of this world into a set of external martial arts and taught it to the robust men in this village so that they would work hard to cultivate in order to obtain extraordinary power and improve their strength. Those strong men were overjoyed to receive this kind of teaching. Their village was just a remote village, although they heard that there was an inheritance of extraordinary power in the big cities. But they had never seen it. Now that they had received the inheritance, how could they not cultivate without eating or sleeping? Luo Fan's understanding of cultivation had already reached a level that ordinary practitioners could not imagine. Based on his understanding of this world, the cultivation method of extraordinary power was naturally extremely perfect. Because of his own limited understanding of this world, and his lack of understanding of the extraordinary rules of this world, the efficiency of the extraordinary power cultivation was not too high. The extraordinary power that he cultivated was not too strong. But there was absolutely no problem with the cultivation method. It was a cultivation method that could definitely cultivate extraordinary power. Therefore, in just 3 months, everyone in the village, regardless of whether they were men or women, young or old, had cultivated transcendent powers. Of course, among them, the strongest was actually equivalent to a third-rate warrior in the ordinary world. In the eyes of ordinary people, they were already unparalleled, but in the eyes of real experts, they were the kind that could kill dozens of people with one finger. The villagers had benefited and their strength had greatly improved, but Luo Fan's efforts were not in vain. Apart from the villagers' reverence for him, he also had a deeper understanding of the extraordinary rules of this world through the cultivation of the indigenous people's extraordinary power. In just a few months, he had already created a cultivation method that was rooted in the worldview from nothing, a cultivation method that was different from external martial arts, and had evolved into an internal martial arts cultivation method. Moreover, as time passed, and as his understanding of the extraordinary rules deepened, the internal martial arts within it continued to sublimate and improve, evolving towards the ultimate immortal cultivation method to him. This was only a matter of time. On this day, Luo Fan was sitting cross-legged in front of the stone house he built and was cultivating the internal martial arts with his eyes closed. The strength of this world itself had already surpassed any world that Luo Fan had seen in the past, including all the worlds he had seen. In such a world, if he wanted to use any extraordinary power, the effect needed to be more than 1,000,000,000,000 times greater than any extraordinary power he had used in any world he had been in before. In other words, even ordinary external martial arts would only be able to exert the effect of extraordinary power when it reached a level that was even comparable to the cultivation path of a false sage. As for internal martial arts, it would only be effective when one had reached the level of a calamity stage powerhouse. At this moment, when Luo Fan was cultivating the internal martial arts, it began to naturally open up a world inside his body. With the countless worlds piled up and arranged in his body, an indescribable meridian system was constructed all over his body. Wisps of powerful power were continuously derived from the meridians formed by these worlds, and they kept converging. They kept increasing and eventually turned into a surging torrent. They flowed up and down his body endlessly. These worlds that he had opened up were quite similar in level to the worlds that existed inside any matter in the outside world. Of course, it was only similar. If he wanted to really reach that level, even he could not do it, don't forget. That was a world that was almost perfect. That kind of world. Back then, when he opened up a world, he needed to use the power of the chaotic state to undergo the great calamity of the world again and again to be able to open it up. Now, even if it had increased by countless times, it was still impossible to open up millions of worlds in his body at will. However, although the level was different from the worlds that existed in the outside world, those worlds also had a characteristic that was far superior to the worlds that existed in the outside world. That was, these worlds were completely opened up according to the worldview of the laws. In other words, these worlds were already inseparable from Luo Fan the moment they were opened up. Not only was he able to control them as he pleased, but the order was even tighter than everything else. Moreover, that order was so tight that it surpassed everything else. Even the order of heaven and earth that the villagers had was far from being able to compare to this power. Given the environment of this world and the laws, with such an order, the improvement of these worlds was obviously only a matter of time. Therefore, although these worlds were not comparable to the worlds inside the outside world, that was only temporary. With the passage of time, one day, these worlds would eventually reach the level of the outside world. In fact, if he thought of some other means, it was not impossible for him to make them surpass the outside world. At this moment, Luo Fan finally completed the opening of the last world and finally established the entire Meridian system. With the complete establishment of the Meridian system, the power inside the Meridian began to be born at a speed that was 100 times faster than before. In the blink of an eye, it filled every inch of the void in his Meridian. The power did not stop being born at this time. Instead, it continued to be born and accumulated in his Meridian system. It constantly squeezed the Meridian system and began to form a strong impact on the Meridian system that had just been formed. Creaking sounds came from the Meridian system as if it was going to completely collapse in the next moment. In the face of such changes, Luo Fan's expression did not change at all. Instead, he began to push the power in his body according to the technique he had experimented over the past few days and began to circulate according to an extremely mysterious path. Under his arduous pushing, the power that was originally chaotic and derived began to become orderly, and in the process of circulating, it began to transform continuously. Its quality was constantly improving, and its essence was constantly sublimating. Finally, after a total of 129,600 cycles, the power finally completed some kind of inexplicable sublimation, and a wisp of indescribable mysterious power was born from it. Although this wisp of power was created by Luo Fan, even he could not fully understand all the properties of this wisp of power. He only knew that this power could form an inexplicable connection with the outside world. This seemed strange, but in fact, it could not be more natural. After all, one should not forget the reason why he had opened the extraordinary door. He had opened the extraordinary door by relying on his own actions to trigger some kind of change in the world. In other words, he had opened the extraordinary door by relying on the power of the world itself. Under such circumstances, the transcendent system derived from the door of transcendence was naturally rooted in the world where he was. In other words, it was the third level of the Tao Master's path. In this way, the power derived from the extraordinary power would be beyond his imagination, and its nature would be so profound that he could not fully grasp it. What was so strange about that? On the contrary, it would be strange if he could fully understand this wisp of power and completely grasp all its properties. After this wisp of power appeared, it began to crazily swallow all the power in his meridian system of heaven and earth and began to grow bit by bit. In the end, when all the power was swallowed, this wisp of power had grown to the size of a thumb. It began to flow along his meridian system of heaven and earth, gradually refining the meridian system, or in other words, refining the world that made up the meridian system. As this power circulated and refined, the world within the meridian system began to tremble slightly. The rules and principles within the world seemed to be undergoing repeated cleansing and were gradually strengthening. The strength of the world itself also gradually increased during this process. In the end, after another 129,600 cycles, this power changed direction and rushed toward the top of the meridian system of heaven and earth, which was the position corresponding to the top of Luo Fan's head. Crack, crack, crack. Earth-shattering roars came from the top of Luo Fan's head at this moment, as if there were giant thunders exploding inside his head. The sound shook the matter around Luo Fan's body, causing it to tremble and jump continuously. It should be known that every matter in this world had its own existence and existence within it. The weight of such an existence was indescribable.